There is something buried beneath the surface of Britain that no one expected to find. Not gold, not ancient weapons, not the ruins of some forgotten temple, though those exist too, scattered across the island like afterthoughts from a world we barely understand. What scientists keep finding is stranger than any of that. It is invisible to the naked eye. It requires machines that cost millions of pounds and teams of researchers who spend years just learning how to read it. And every single time they extract it from a fragment of ancient bone or a crumbling tooth pulled from some waterlogged grave, it rewrites the story of who the British people are and where they came from. This is ancient DNA, and it is telling us things that no history book ever could. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I check every single comment, and it never stops fascinating me. Someone in Edinburgh at midnight, someone in Texas at 3 in the morning, someone in Melbourne at sunrise, all of us pulled together by the same quiet mystery. The question of who we really are and what long-forgotten people carried in their blood so that we might eventually exist. The island we now call Britain sits at the far western edge of Europe, battered by Atlantic winds, wrapped in grey light for most of the year. People have been living there for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. Not just centuries, not just millennia. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of years, though the story gets complicated quickly. The people who walked across what is now the English Channel when it was still dry land, back when sea levels were low enough that Britain was not yet an island at all, those people were not like us. They were earlier human species, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals. Beings who made tools and probably had language and certainly had communities, but who were not anatomically modern humans in the way you and I are. The story of the people who became the British, the people whose bones are now yielding their secrets to geneticists in laboratories in Cambridge and Copenhagen and Leipzig, begins in a narrower window of time. Roughly 40,000 years ago, give or take, modern humans began arriving in Europe from the east and south. They crossed mountain ranges and river valleys, and the slowly narrowing land bridge that would eventually become submerged beneath the cold waters of what we now call the North Sea and the English Channel. When they reached the far northwestern tip of Europe, when they pushed through dense forest and across open grassland and eventually stood at the edges of cliffs looking out over grey water, they were at the end of the world as any human had ever known it. And then the ice came back. Around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, the ice sheets advanced so far south that much of what we now call Britain was simply uninhabitable. Not cold in the way British winters are cold today, cold in a way that meant there was no Britain at all, really. Just ice and permafrost, and a howling emptiness where eventually one of the most storied landscapes in human history would slowly emerge. The people who had been living there, the people who painted animals on cave walls and buried their dead with careful ceremony and hunted mammoths across what is now the Yorkshire Dales, those people retreated south, into the warmer refuges of southwestern Europe, into the Iberian Peninsula, into southern France. They survived there, in pockets of relative warmth, while the ice held the north captive. This is where ancient DNA begins to tell its most startling early chapter in the British story. Because when the ice retreated, when the glaciers began their slow northward withdrawal and the land became habitable again, people came back, and the DNA of those returning people has recently been extracted from bones found in sites across Britain, and what it shows is both logical and strangely moving. These were the descendants of those who had fled. They came back to the land their ancestors had left, carrying in their cells the genetic signature of southwestern European Ice Age refuges. They were, in a very literal sense, returning home to a place they had never personally seen, but they were not alone for long. Sit with this for a moment, because it matters enormously for everything that follows. Around 9,000 years ago, Britain was still connected to continental Europe by a low-lying land bridge that geologists call Doggerland. It stretched across what is now the southern North Sea, a vast wetland and river delta and hunting ground that was home to its own communities of hunter-gatherers. Those people fished the rivers and hunted the forests and built whatever structures people build when they know the land beneath their feet is solid and will remain so. Then the sea rose, slowly at first, and then catastrophically when a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, the Storegga Slide, sent a tsunami crashing across the lowlands. Doggerland was swallowed by water, Britain became an island, and around the same time, something else was happening in the east, something that would eventually wash across the continent and transform every population it touched: farming. The revolution of food production, the shift from following animals and gathering wild plants to planting seeds and tending herds, had begun thousands of years earlier in the Fertile Crescent, in the region we now call the Middle East. Slowly, painfully, slowly, by modern standards, it spread westward through Anatolia, into Greece, along the coasts of the Mediterranean, through Central Europe, and eventually, around 6,000 years ago, it reached Britain. Now, here is the question that kept archaeologists debating for decades before ancient DNA could intervene. Did farming spread because people spread? Or did farming spread as an idea, a set of techniques and plants and animals that indigenous hunter-gatherers simply adopted while remaining themselves genetically? It sounds like an academic question, but the answer has profound implications. If farming spread through migration, then the people who built the great megalithic monuments of Neolithic Britain, the people who constructed Stonehenge's earliest phases and raised the chambered tombs of the Orkneys and buried their dead in long barrows across the chalk downlands of southern England, those people were not the descendants of the original post-glacial inhabitants. They were newcomers, immigrants, people who had come from somewhere else. The ancient DNA is unequivocal. Farming came with farmers. When scientists at Harvard and Copenhagen and dozens of other institutions extracted DNA from Neolithic human remains found across Britain, what they found was a genetic signal that was almost entirely different from the hunter-gatherers who had been living on the island before. The Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain around 6,000 years ago carried DNA that traced back, overwhelmingly, to Anatolian populations, to the people of what is now modern Turkey. They came by sea, mostly, along the Atlantic coast, into the Irish Sea, settling in river valleys and on hilltops and along the coasts, bringing with them their cattle and their pigs and their wheat, and their tradition of building enormous stone monuments to their dead. And what happened to the hunter-gatherers who were already there? This is where it gets haunting. The hunter-gatherers who had lived in Britain for thousands of years before the farmers arrived, who had followed red deer through ancient forests and harvested hazelnuts and fished the rivers and buried their dead in ways we can still only partially reconstruct, those people did not simply blend with the incoming farmers. The genetic evidence suggests something far more dramatic and far harder to explain. Within a few generations, maybe 2 or 3, the genetic signature of the indigenous British hunter-gatherers almost entirely disappeared from the archaeological record. Not slowly, not gradually, almost completely. This is one of the great mysteries in the ancient DNA of Britain. We do not know if this represents violence, epidemic disease carried by the farmers, against which the hunter-gatherers had no immunity. Out-competition for resources so total and so swift that the existing population simply could not sustain itself. Or some combination of all of these things. What we know is the result. By the time Britain entered the full flowering of the Neolithic period, the people who were living there, the people who were building the great stone monuments, were overwhelmingly descended from Anatolian farmers rather than the indigenous Western European hunter-gatherers who had repopulated the island after the Ice Age. There is a tiny thread of genetic continuity, a whisper of the old lineages persisting here and there. Scientists can see it in a few individuals' genomes, but it is so faint, so marginal, that it suggests complete and catastrophic replacement rather than gradual mixing. Whatever happened when the farmers arrived in Britain, it was one of the most consequential demographic events in the island's history, and we still do not fully understand why or how it unfolded so completely. But here is the thing about ancient DNA research. Just when you think you have begun to understand the shape of the story, another wave of evidence arrives and rearranges everything. Around 4,400 years ago, something happened that was even more dramatic than the arrival of farming. A new group of people began spreading westward across Europe, from the Pontic steppe, the vast grasslands that stretch across what is now Ukraine and Russia. These people carried a genetic signature that researchers call the Yamnaya ancestry, named for an archaeological culture identified by their distinctive burial mounds called kurgans. They were pastoralists, herders who moved their animals across vast distances. They had horses, they had wheeled vehicles, and they carried with them something else, something invisible and devastating and world-changing. A genetic variant that modern scientists believe may have conferred significant resistance to certain diseases. When these steppe peoples reached Western Europe, they did not simply arrive and settle peacefully alongside the existing farming populations. What the ancient DNA shows is another population replacement of startling completeness. Within a few centuries, the genetic ancestry of the people living in Britain shifted so dramatically that by about 4,000 years ago, roughly 90% of the ancestry of the British Isles had changed. The Neolithic farmers who had replaced the hunter-gatherers were themselves replaced, or nearly so, by people descended from the steppe migrants. These are the people archaeologists associate with the bell beaker culture, named for their distinctive pottery shaped like an inverted bell. They came to Britain, and they transformed everything. The monuments continued to be built, including the great trilithons of Stonehenge erected during precisely this period of transition. But the people building them were no longer the same people whose ancestors had started the project. It is as if a great construction was begun by one civilization and completed by another, the stone carrying the memory of hands that were long gone. The language that arrived with the Beaker people, or more precisely with the steppe ancestry that underlies them, is believed by many linguists to be the ancestor of the languages spoken across most of Europe today. The Indo-European languages, English, French, Spanish, German, Greek, Russian, Hindi, Persian, all of them, tracing back through thousands of years of change and divergence, to dialects spoken by people who herded cattle across Ukrainian grasslands 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. When you speak English, you are in some sense speaking a language whose ultimate origin lies in those steppe communities. That lineage lives in your mouth every time you open it. The Bronze Age people who emerged from this mixing of steppe migrants with the remnant populations of Neolithic farmers are the ancestors of the people we tend to think of as ancient Britons. But the story does not stop there, not by a very long distance. Around 3,000 years ago, give or take several centuries in either direction, depending on region and local conditions, a new wave of people began arriving in Britain from continental Europe. These are the people we call the Celts, though that term is complicated and hotly contested among scholars in ways that we will come to later. They brought iron technology, which is why archaeologists call this period the Iron Age. They brought new artistic traditions, new religious practices, new languages that eventually evolved into Welsh and Cornish and Scots Gaelic and Irish. And they brought more new DNA, further layering the genetic complexity of the British population. But something interesting happens in the ancient DNA record as we move through the Iron Age and approach the period of Roman Britain. The population changes become less dramatic. The genetic signals of the earlier Bronze Age populations persist with more continuity, which suggests that while new people were certainly arriving, they were arriving in smaller numbers relative to the existing population, and the result was mixing rather than replacement. This is when the genetic story of Britain begins to feel more like the kind of thing we might recognize as history rather than prehistory. Named peoples with documented cultures rather than anonymous waves of migrants tracked only through their bones and their pottery and their changing genetic profiles. But even in this period, in the centuries before and during Roman occupation, the ancient DNA is producing surprises that no one quite expected. Here is a detail that almost no popular account of ancient Britain includes, and that the DNA evidence has only recently brought to light. The population of Roman Britain was far more cosmopolitan, far more diverse in its origins, than anyone who has stood in front of a Roman mosaic or a reconstructed Roman villa in the British countryside would intuitively imagine. The Roman legions that garrisoned Britain from the invasion of 43 CE until the withdrawal in the early 5th century CE were not composed entirely of Italians. They were not even composed mostly of Italians. The Roman military machine recruited from across the enormous extent of the empire. From North Africa, from Syria, from the Balkans, from the Rhine and Danube frontiers, from Iberia, The people stationed at Hadrian's Wall, the 73-mile fortification that stretched across the narrowest part of Britain from the Solway Firth to the Tyne, came from everywhere the Roman world touched. Ancient DNA, extracted from burials associated with Roman period Britain, is beginning to confirm this with a specificity that takes your breath away. Individual skeletons from sites in York and London and the military zones of the north show genetic ancestry tracing to North Africa, to the Eastern Mediterranean, to populations that no simplistic version of Roman Britain would ever have included. These were real people. They lived and died on the island. Some of them are buried with objects that suggest they maintained connections to distant homelands, wearing jewelry in styles from the Eastern Empire, interred with pottery imported from North Africa. What this tells us, and what ancient DNA is only beginning to fully articulate, is that Roman Britain was not a simple story of Roman conquerors and Celtic subjects. It was a genuinely mixed, genuinely diverse society that included people of extremely varied origins, all living together within the framework of the most extensive administrative system the ancient world had ever produced. And when Rome withdrew, when the legions pulled back across the Channel, and Britain was left to govern itself in the fractious centuries that followed, all of that diversity was already woven into the fabric of the island's population. And then came the Anglo-Saxons. Few transformations in British history have been debated as fiercely as the nature and extent of the Anglo-Saxon migrations that followed the end of Roman rule. The traditional narrative, the one taught in schools and dramatized in countless television programs, goes something like this. After Rome withdrew, Germanic peoples from what are now the Netherlands and Germany and Denmark began raiding and then settling the eastern and southern coasts of Britain. These Anglo-Saxons, as they came to be known, eventually dominated most of what we now call England. They brought their languages, which eventually became Old English, and then Middle English, and eventually the modern English you are listening to right now. The Celtic-speaking populations of Britain were pushed west, into Wales and Cornwall, and eventually across the sea to Brittany, and the cultural and linguistic identity of England was born. But how much of this was migration? And how much was cultural change adopted by an existing population? That question has generated more academic argument than almost any other in British archaeology. Some scholars argued for what they called elite transfer, the idea that a relatively small number of Anglo-Saxon migrants achieved political dominance and then their culture and language spread among a much larger existing population that was genetically still largely descended from Romano-British and Iron Age predecessors. Others argued for more substantial migration, perhaps replacing or at least massively diluting the existing population of Eastern Britain. Ancient DNA has now entered this debate, and as usual, the truth it reveals is more complex and more interesting than any simple answer. Studies published over the past decade, drawing on DNA from hundreds of skeletons dating to the early medieval period across England, suggest that the Anglo-Saxon migrations were substantial. In eastern England especially, the region where the Anglo-Saxons arrived first and established themselves most completely, the genetic ancestry of the population shifted significantly toward northwestern continental European ancestry, consistent with Germanic origins. In some early medieval cemeteries in eastern England, the majority of individuals show ancestry that traces to continental northwestern Europe rather than to the earlier British Iron Age and Romano-British populations. But here is where it gets genuinely surprising. Even in the East, even in the heartland of Anglo-Saxon England, this was not complete replacement. There is persistent genetic evidence of the earlier populations. Mixed individuals appear in the burial record alongside those with primarily continental ancestry. And as you move westward across England, the proportion of ancestry tracing to the earlier British populations increases until in Wales and in parts of the north and west, continuity with the pre-Anglo-Saxon population is the dominant signal in the DNA. What this paints is a picture of a fragmented, region-by-region transformation. Not a simple conquest followed by population replacement, but a varied and geographically differentiated process in which migration, intermarriage, social pressure, language shift, and cultural adoption all play different roles in different places. The Anglo-Saxon transformation of Britain was real. It was substantial. But it was not total. and the people who were there before did not simply vanish. There is a location in England, a village in Yorkshire, that has become something of a landmark in the study of British ancient DNA. It is called Driffield Terrace, and it is a site where the skeletal remains of multiple decapitated individuals from the Roman period were discovered. The unusual burial practices caught the attention of archaeologists decades ago, but when DNA was extracted from these individuals and analyzed, the results were astonishing in ways that went far beyond the macabre circumstances of their deaths. Among the individuals buried there, researchers found genetic ancestry that traced to the Eastern Mediterranean, to North Africa, to multiple different regions of the Roman world. These were not local Romano-Britons. They were people who had traveled extraordinary distances, in life or in their ancestry, to end up in a provincial Roman town in Yorkshire, and they were buried together, suggesting some kind of shared identity or shared fate, though what exactly that fate was and why their heads were removed remains as mysterious as it ever was. Driffield Terrace is one example among many of what ancient DNA is revealing about the sheer diversity of Roman Britain. But it also illustrates something broader about what this research is doing to our understanding of British identity and British history. It is dissolving the idea that there was ever a pure or simple British people. Every time scientists drill into an ancient tooth or extract a fragment of collagen from an ancient bone, they find complexity, they find mixture, they find people moving across vast distances, living alongside people radically different from themselves in origin and culture and language, and sometimes intermarrying with them and creating children who carried all of those divergent ancestries combined in a single body. The modern British population is the end product of all of this. Every person in Britain today carries the traces of this enormously complicated history. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, the Beaker people from the steppe, the Iron Age Celts, the Roman garrison troops from across the empire, the Anglo-Saxons from the continent, the Vikings, who we have not yet spoken about at all, the Normans, and dozens of smaller waves and trickles of migration that left their marks in ways that are only now becoming visible through the technology of ancient genomics. Let us talk about the Vikings, because their genetic contribution to Britain is another story that the DNA is complicating in fascinating ways. The Viking Age, roughly the 8th through 11th centuries, is one of those periods of British history that feels both familiar and deeply strange. Familiar because it is relatively recent, within the span of recorded history, and because the Vikings left behind not just genetic traces but written accounts, place names, legal traditions, and cultural influences that are still visible in the landscape and language of northern Britain. Strange because the reality of the Viking presence in Britain was so varied and so geographically specific that generalization does it a disservice. In some parts of Britain, particularly in the Northern Isles, in Orkney and Shetland, the Viking impact was so complete and so sustained that the existing population was largely replaced. Ancient DNA from early medieval Orkney shows a dramatic shift in ancestry around the time of Norse settlement, with the incoming population showing ancestry consistent with Scandinavian origins and the earlier inhabitants essentially disappearing from the genetic record. The Norse who settled Orkney did not merely impose their culture on an existing Celtic-speaking population. They appear to have replaced that population almost entirely, perhaps through violence, perhaps through disease, perhaps simply through the sheer weight of numbers combined with sustained and deliberate settlement. In other parts of Britain, the Viking impact was more like what we saw with the Anglo-Saxons, significant but incomplete. In Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, in the region that historical sources call the Danelaw, there is clear genetic evidence of Scandinavian ancestry in medieval populations. But there is also clear evidence of mixing with the existing population, and the result over time was blending rather than replacement. And, in some areas, particularly in the far west and in Ireland, where Viking towns like Dublin were established as trading ports rather than agricultural settlements, the genetic impact of the Viking presence appears to have been more limited than the enormous cultural impact might suggest. The Norse, who founded Dublin and traded through the Irish seaports, were enormously influential in shaping the cultural and economic landscape of the region. But they were traders more than settlers in many cases, and their genetic footprint reflects that. One of the most fascinating recent findings in this area comes from a study of ancient DNA from Viking Age cemeteries across the Norse world. What that research revealed was that the people we call Vikings were not ethnically or genetically homogeneous. The crews of Viking ships included people of British and Irish ancestry, people with ancestry tracing to the Baltic, people who were genetically more like the populations of continental Europe than like the stereotypical Norse raider of popular imagination. The Viking world was, like the Roman world that preceded it, a cosmopolitan enterprise that moved people around in ways that mixed ancestries and blurred the boundaries between groups we tend to think of as separate. Here is a moment to sit with. Picture a winter night, sometime in the late 9th century. The sky over York is the same sky you might look up at tonight. Though without any electric glow softening the darkness, the stars would have been piercingly bright. In the streets of the city the Norse had renamed Jorvik. You could have heard 3 or 4 languages being spoken within a single evening's walk. Old Norse from the Danish settlers who now controlled much of the city's economy and politics. Old English from the English-speaking population that had been there before the Norse arrived and was still there alongside them. Latin from the clergy who maintained the churches. And perhaps fragments of other languages, Irish from traders who had come up from the ports of the Irish Sea, Flemish from merchants who had crossed the Channel for the market. The people living in that city were carrying in their bodies ancestry from all of those different sources and more. Some of them were the children of Norse fathers and English mothers. Some were the descendants of Romano-British families who had been in York for 7 or 8 centuries. Some had ancestry tracing back to the Scandinavian world and ancestry tracing back to the Celtic-speaking populations of the north, all mixed together in a single person. And none of them knew any of this in the way we can now begin to understand it. They had no concept of genetics, no awareness of ancient DNA, no ability to trace their ancestry through the deep layers of time that we are now beginning to explore with our extraordinary machines and our painstaking laboratory techniques. What they knew was their family, their community, their language, their faith, their place in the social hierarchy of their world. What we can now add to that picture is the invisible history written in their cells. The ancient DNA revolution in British prehistory has not been limited to the movements of large populations. Some of the most striking findings have come from studies of specific regions, specific sites, specific individuals whose genetic profiles reveal things that seem almost impossible. Take the case of the Cheddar Man. In 1903, workers excavating Gough's Cave in the Cheddar Gorge in Somerset uncovered a human skeleton. The skeleton turned out to be approximately 9,000 years old, making it the oldest complete human skeleton ever found in Britain. For nearly a century, Cheddar Man sat in museum collections, studied by archaeologists, but unable to yield the deepest secrets locked within his bones. Then, in 2018, an international team of scientists extracted ancient DNA from a fragment of his skull and sequenced his genome. The results caused genuine cultural shock in Britain. Cheddar Man, one of the earliest inhabitants of Britain after the last ice age, had dark skin. Dark brown or black, the scientists estimated with reasonable confidence based on the genetic variants associated with skin pigmentation. He also had blue eyes. And his hair was dark and probably wavy or curly. This was not what anyone had imagined when they thought about Stone Age Britons. The popular image had always been something like a fair-skinned, perhaps reddish-haired individual, the archetypal Celtic type of later imagination. But Cheddar Man's genome told a completely different story. The combination of dark skin and blue eyes that he carried is actually the ancestral condition for the first modern humans who arrived in Europe from Africa. The pale skin that most modern Europeans carry is a relatively recent adaptation, driven by the need to synthesize sufficient vitamin D in the low sunlight conditions of high-latitude Europe. It took thousands of years for that adaptation to become common. And here is perhaps the most remarkable detail. A local schoolteacher in the village of Cheddar, a man named Adrian Target, submitted a DNA sample as part of the same 1,997 study that first analyzed Cheddar Man's mitochondrial DNA. The comparison showed that Adrian Target is a direct maternal line descendant of Cheddar Man. The genes of a person who lived 9,000 years ago have persisted in a continuous chain of mothers and daughters to the present day in the same region of England where those ancient bones were found. The work that has been done on ancient British DNA is part of a much larger global project, one that is slowly, and sometimes controversially, reconstructing the deep genetic history of our entire species. The same techniques that revealed the complexity of the British population replacement events have been applied across the world, and what they show is that the kind of dramatic demographic upheavals seen in prehistoric Britain were not unique to that island. They were the rule rather than the exception. Human populations have replaced each other, mixed with each other, and transformed each other repeatedly throughout our history, at speeds and on scales that no previous method of investigation could detect. But there is something particular about Britain, something that makes the ancient DNA findings from that island especially striking and especially contested. Britain has a peculiar relationship with its own sense of identity. It is a small island with an enormous history, a place that spent several centuries ruling a substantial fraction of the world's land surface, and has spent the decades since that empire's end in a complicated conversation with itself about who it is and what it means to be British. Questions of national origin, of who belongs, of what constitutes authentic connection to the island and its history, carry emotional and political weight in Britain that makes the findings of ancient DNA research something more than merely academic. When scientists announced that the Neolithic monument builders of Britain were largely descended from Anatolian migrants rather than the indigenous hunter-gatherer population, and when the same scientists then showed that those Neolithic farmers were themselves replaced by steppe migrants, carrying what became the Indo-European language tradition, the implications rippled outward in ways that were not always comfortable. The people who built Stonehenge were not, in any simple genetic sense, the ancestors of the British people. The people who built Britain's most famous monument were themselves newcomers who had replaced an earlier population who then were themselves replaced. And yet, this very fact, the fact that Britain has always been a place where populations have arrived and transformed and been transformed, is itself a profound statement about the nature of British identity and the nature of human identity more broadly. There is no pure original British people. There never was. Every claim to pure ancestry in Britain, every mythology of deep, unbroken roots in the island's soil, dissolves under the light of ancient DNA. What is found instead is something more interesting, and in many ways, more honest. A story of continuous arrival, continuous mixing, continuous becoming. We need to talk about something that happens in the ancient DNA record around 1500 years ago, because it is one of the most mysterious and most debated features of the entire British genetic story. During the early medieval period, in the centuries following the end of Roman rule, the genetic landscape of Britain underwent dramatic changes in the east and less dramatic changes in the west. The Anglo-Saxon migrations brought substantial new ancestry from northwestern continental Europe. This much we have already covered. But nestled within that period of transformation, something else appears in the data that geneticists are still working to fully understand. There are individuals in the early medieval record of Britain, people buried in the centuries between roughly 400 and 700 CE, who show genetic profiles that do not fit neatly into any of the expected categories. They are not simply indigenous Romano-British individuals. They are not simply continental Anglo-Saxon migrants. They carry unusual combinations of ancestry that suggest connections to populations far to the east, or to populations whose relationships to the main groups are not yet well understood. Some researchers think this reflects the complexity of Roman-era migration, people whose genetic profiles trace to unusual combinations of Roman world ancestry, persisting into the post-Roman period. Others think it reflects smaller waves of migration that the historical record either does not mention or mentions only obliquely. The Frisian traders, the Frankish merchants, the Irish monks who established monasteries across northern Britain and left not only cultural but perhaps genetic traces of their presence. The honest answer is that we do not yet fully understand these outlier individuals. Ancient DNA research is still young. The databases of ancient genomes, while growing rapidly, are still incomplete. The statistical tools for analyzing complex multi-way population mixing are still being refined. Every year brings new findings that require revision of models that seemed settled the year before. This is not a weakness of the science, it is the nature of genuine investigation. Every answer reveals new questions. Every solved mystery opens a door onto a corridor full of other closed doors, each with its own complicated lock. Let us turn now to something that is not well known outside specialist circles, but that the ancient DNA research is beginning to bring into sharp focus. The genetic history of Scotland is different from the genetic history of England in ways that are fascinating and revealing, and that connect to some of the oldest and most persistent questions about the identity of the northern part of the programmes. Ireland, Scotland's genetic story, as it is emerging from the ancient DNA record, is in some ways a compressed and more extreme version of the English story. The same broad waves of Neolithic farmers and then beaker people from the steppe washed across Scotland, transforming the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations in patterns broadly similar to what happened further south. But the specific regional variations within Scotland are extraordinary. The Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, as we have already seen, were essentially replaced by Norse settlers during the Viking Age in ways that were more complete than almost anywhere else in Britain. The DNA of modern Orcadians reflects this history. They carry more Scandinavian ancestry than the inhabitants of almost any other part of the British Isles outside those islands. But in the Highlands and the Western Isles, something different happened. These are areas where the terrain was more challenging, the agricultural potential more limited, and where the successive waves of migration that transformed the lowlands made less impact. In some of these areas, the ancient DNA shows remarkable continuity. Populations that carry genetic profiles traceable to the Neolithic, and even in faint traces, to pre-Neolithic populations. Living at the edges of the island, in the places where the weather was harshest, and the soil thinnest, and the social pressure to change and adapt was least intense, the oldest genetic lineages of Britain have persisted. The Gaelic-speaking communities of the Scottish Highlands and Islands are not, of course, simply unchanged survivors from the Neolithic. Language, culture, and genetics do not track each other so perfectly. Scottish Gaelic is an Indo-European language, which means it ultimately traces its origins to the same steppe expansion that brought Indo-European languages across Europe. But the people who now speak it carry in their bodies genetic threads that are older than the language itself, strands of ancestry that connect them to the ancient populations of the Atlantic fringe in ways that are only now becoming legible. There is a specific genetic marker that appears frequently in discussions of ancient British and Irish DNA, and it is worth pausing to explain what it is and why it matters. The Y chromosome, the chromosome that is passed from father to son through the male line, provides a particularly useful tool for tracing ancestry, because it changes only slowly over time, and because the changes that do occur can be used to build a genealogical tree of paternal lineages. One major branch of that tree, called R1b, is extraordinarily common in Western Britain and Ireland. In some populations on the Atlantic fringe, in parts of Ireland and Wales, and the Basque country of northern Spain, R1b reaches frequencies of more than 80%. Almost 9 out of 10 men carry this particular paternal lineage. For decades, the origin of R1b was hotly debated. Some researchers believed it was a very ancient lineage, carried by the original Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who repopulated Europe after the last ice age. Others argued it was more recent, brought by Neolithic farmers or even by later migrations. Ancient DNA has resolved this debate, and the resolution was surprising. The dominant R1b lineages found in modern Western European populations, including in Britain and Ireland, are not Paleolithic relics. They are not Neolithic. They are, for the most part, steppe-derived. They came with the people who spread across Europe from the Pontic steppe around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, the people associated with the Bell Beaker phenomenon, whose arrival transformed the genetic makeup of the British Isles so dramatically. What this means is that the Y chromosome carried by most men in Ireland and Wales and Highland Scotland, the very regions most associated with Celtic identity and most resistant to various waves of conquest and Anglicization, traces its ultimate patrilineal origin not to the ancient inhabitants of the Atlantic West, but to the same steppe populations whose expansion created the Indo-European language family that eventually gave rise to the very languages these men speak. The Celt and the Anglo-Saxon, the Gael and the Lowland Scot, all carry in their Y chromosomes the same deep origin in the Eurasian steppe. This is not a comfortable finding for anyone who had built a sense of ethnic or national identity on the idea that they were the original, unchanged inhabitants of their particular corner of Britain. But it is an illuminating one, because what it shows is that identity is constructed on top of biology, not determined by it. The people who speak Welsh or Irish or Scots Gaelic today are not speaking those languages because of the particular genetics they carry. They are speaking those languages because of the cultures and communities that transmitted those languages through time. The DNA is one story, the culture is another, and the two stories do not always run parallel. Now we need to take the story somewhere unexpected, somewhere that Britain's ancient DNA intersects with mysteries that range far beyond the island itself, out across the Atlantic Ocean to the western edges of the known ancient world and beyond. Because one of the most extraordinary questions that ancient genomics is beginning to address is whether the people of ancient Britain, or more precisely the people of the ancient Atlantic world of which Britain was a part, had connections with the Americas that predate Columbus by thousands of years. This is not a fringe theory. It is a serious scientific question that the evidence, while not conclusive, is beginning to bring into the realm of genuine investigation. Here is the context. The Atlantic coast of Western Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula up through France and Britain and Ireland, and ultimately to Scandinavia, was during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods home to a network of maritime communities that were in contact with each other over enormous distances. We know this because we can trace the movement of specific types of stone and specific types of metal and specific types of pottery across the Atlantic coastline. We know that megalithic building traditions, the practice of constructing enormous monuments from massive stone blocks, spread along this Atlantic facade in ways that suggest ongoing contact between communities separated by hundreds of miles of open ocean. These were not people who were afraid of the sea. They were people who had built their entire way of life around the sea. And some of them, pushed by curiosity or necessity or both, may have gone further than anyone has yet been able to prove archaeologically. The evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas has been a source of controversy for well over a century. Most proposed connections have turned out to be wishful thinking, poor archaeology, or outright fraud. The runic inscriptions, supposedly found in Minnesota, the Roman coins alleged to have been discovered in ancient American sites, the claims of Welsh Indians or Irish monks who crossed the Atlantic before Columbus, most of these have crumbled under scrutiny. But ancient DNA is now providing a new kind of evidence, one that is much harder to dismiss than dubious artifacts or misinterpreted inscriptions. In 2020, a study analyzing the genomes of ancient and modern indigenous populations of the Americas found evidence of genetic mixing between South American populations and a population from the Pacific, specifically from Polynesia, that appears to have occurred around 800 years ago. The Polynesians, whose extraordinary maritime culture spread people across the vast Pacific, appear to have made contact with South America, and the genetic evidence for that contact shows up in the DNA of indigenous South Americans alive today and in ancient South American individuals who lived before Columbus arrived. This finding, which was published in the journal Nature and is now broadly accepted among geneticists, establishes a crucial principle. Ancient genetic mixing events, even ones that involved long ocean crossings, leave traces that can be detected hundreds or thousands of years later. The signal persists. The history of contact is written in the DNA of descendants. With that principle established, researchers have begun asking more pointed questions about the Atlantic. Specifically, whether similar signals of ancient contact might be detectable in indigenous American populations, signals that could point to connections with the ancient populations of Western Europe. The results so far are intriguing rather than conclusive, and it is important to be honest about that distinction. Some researchers, analyzing the genomes of ancient North American individuals, have reported what they describe as anomalous genetic signals. Small proportions of ancestry that do not fit neatly into the expected pattern of ancestry derived from the founding populations of the Americas, who themselves derived from the ancient populations of northeastern Asia. These anomalous signals appear in some individuals from specific geographic areas, particular coastal regions where ocean-going contact with outsiders would have been most plausible. Most mainstream geneticists are skeptical. The proportions involved are small. The statistical methods for detecting such ancient and faint signals are contested, and the possibility of contamination of modern European DNA inadvertently entering ancient samples during excavation or laboratory processing is a genuine concern that researchers take seriously and work hard to guard against. But the skeptics have not closed the question. They have simply demanded, reasonably, more evidence, more samples, better methodology, replication across independent laboratories. The conversation is ongoing, and it is conducted not on the fringes of science, but in legitimate peer-reviewed journals by researchers who take the question seriously precisely because the stakes, if contact did occur, are so significant for our understanding of human history. There is a specific figure from the ancient world whose story, when viewed through the lens of what the DNA is beginning to suggest, takes on a completely different dimension. St. Brendan of Clonfert was a 6th century Irish monk who, according to the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, one of the most widely circulated texts of the early medieval period, sailed westward from Ireland across the Atlantic and reached a land of extraordinary wonders. The Navigatio describes a fantastic voyage full of miraculous encounters and theological allegory, and for centuries it was read primarily as spiritual literature rather than factual geography. But in 1976 and 1977, the explorer and writer Tim Severin demonstrated something remarkable. He built a currach, a traditional Irish boat made from oxhide stretched over a wicker frame, of the kind that early medieval Irish monks would have used for coastal voyages. He sailed it from Ireland northward to the Faroe Islands, then to Iceland, then along the edge of Greenland and the Labrador coast, finally reaching Newfoundland. The voyage proved that the technology available to early medieval Irish monks was sufficient to cross the Atlantic. That the route described in the Navigatio, hopping from island to island across the North Atlantic, was physically feasible. Was Brendan's voyage historical? Did Irish monks actually reach North America 6 centuries before the Norse and nearly 1,000 years before Columbus? The answer is that we do not know. There is no archaeological evidence of an Irish monastic presence in North America from the 6th century, but the archaeology of early medieval North Atlantic settlement is still young, and absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What the ancient DNA might eventually contribute to this question is the ability to detect if Irish or Western European genetic ancestry appears in Native American populations at frequencies and with timings that cannot be explained by colonial-era European contact, whether some pre-Columbian crossing did occur. The technology to do this kind of analysis is now available. The question is whether the right ancient samples exist, and whether the signals, if they are there, will be detectable above the noise. But let us step back from the edge of that particular question and return to something more firmly established. Because even within the conventional story of ancient Britain, the DNA is producing findings that are strange enough to reshape everything we thought we knew. One of the most significant recent findings concerns the people who built the megalithic monuments of Neolithic Britain. Stonehenge is the most famous, but it is far from the only one. Britain and Ireland are dotted with thousands of megalithic structures, chambered tombs and stone circles and standing stones and henges that were built during the Neolithic period, roughly between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago. We now know from the ancient DNA that these monuments were built by the Anatolian-derived farming populations who arrived in Britain around 6,000 years ago. But we are beginning to learn something about those people that is deeply strange and hard to explain. A study published in 2019 analysed the DNA of individuals buried in Neolithic chambered tombs in Britain and Ireland, including the famous passage tombs of the Boyne Valley in Ireland, the complex at Newgrange that aligns with the winter solstice sunrise. What the researchers found in several of these tombs was unexpected. Some of the individuals buried in high-status positions within these monuments were the products of first-degree incest. That is, their parents were either siblings or a parent and a child. In one case, the individual buried in what appears to have been a central, high-status position within a passage tomb was the son of a brother and sister. This is not something that would occur by accident or by poverty of options. These were the people who were interring their dead in the most elaborate and carefully constructed monuments in the landscape, who had the resources to build structures that, in some cases, required hundreds of people working over many years. They were, in any meaningful sense, the elite of their society. And they were practicing deliberate, close incest, in a way that is reminiscent of later practices among royal families in ancient Egypt, where pharaohs married their sisters in part to concentrate power and maintain divine bloodlines. Why were the Neolithic elites of Britain and Ireland practicing first-degree incest? We do not know, but the discovery itself is remarkable. It suggests that these ancient societies, which we have tended to think of as relatively egalitarian because they lack the obvious trappings of later hierarchical cultures, actually had power structures sophisticated enough to maintain heritable elite status across generations and practiced deliberate biological strategies to do so. There is another detail from the Neolithic period that the ancient DNA research is illuminating in ways that are only beginning to be understood. It concerns the question of sex and ancestry. When geneticists analyze ancient populations, they can, in many cases, determine not just the overall genetic makeup of a population, but how that genetic makeup was distributed between males and females. And what they find in the Neolithic period, and especially in the transition to the Bronze Age, when the steppe-derived Beaker people arrived, is striking. In the early phases of the Beaker expansion across Europe, the genetic ancestry of the arriving population shows up more strongly in males than in females. This asymmetry suggests that when the steppe-derived people arrived in Britain and other parts of Europe, they were initially arriving predominantly as men who then had children with local women, creating a first generation of mixed ancestry in which the paternal line traced to the steppe and the maternal line traced to the Neolithic farming populations. Over subsequent generations, as the Beaker communities became established and began reproducing within themselves, this asymmetry evened out, but the initial signal suggests something specific about how this migration unfolded. It was not simply whole communities of farmers and their families picking up and moving. It involved, at least in the early stages, men moving without women or with fewer women than men. In some cases, this might have meant violence, the displacement of existing men, and the incorporation of existing women. In others, it might have meant trade, alliance, gift exchange, and the movement of male elites into positions of power within existing communities. We cannot determine the exact social mechanisms from the DNA alone, but the signal is clear, and it adds another layer of complexity to the already complex story of how Britain's population was transformed during the Bronze Age. The story of ancient DNA in Britain cannot be told without addressing something that sits at its intersection with the question of race. It is a subject that requires care and clarity, because the misuse of genetic findings about human populations has a long and ugly history, and the ancient DNA revolution is taking place in a world where that history has not been fully reckoned with. When scientists say that the Neolithic population of Britain was largely replaced by incoming steppe-derived populations, this is a straightforward demographic finding. It describes what happened to the genes of people who lived in a specific place at a specific time. It says nothing about the relative worth or capability or civilization of any of the populations involved. When scientists find that the ancient Britons of different periods had varying skin tones and eye colors, this is a finding about the genetics of pigmentation. It says nothing about the relative beauty or value of any appearance. And yet these findings have been seized upon by people with agendas that the scientists themselves do not share and actively repudiate. The finding that Cheddar Man had dark skin was used, almost immediately after it was published, by far-right commentators who argued that it somehow proved that the true British people were not white Europeans. This was a complete distortion of what the science actually shows, which is simply that the genetic variants for light skin that are now common in European populations were not present in the European hunter-gatherer populations of 9,000 years ago and evolved to greater frequency later. The finding that steppe populations replaced earlier European populations has been misused in the opposite direction to suggest that some groups have a deeper or more legitimate claim to European identity than others. Again, this misses the entire point of what the DNA shows, which is that there is no such thing as a pure ancestral European population. There are only successive layers of migration and replacement and mixing, going back as far as the technology can see. Ancient DNA is a science of complexity and nuance. Its findings resist the simple narratives that political ideologues of various kinds want to impose on them. The honest reading of what the DNA tells us about Britain is that the island has always been a place of arrivals, always been a place where new people came and changed what was already there, and were changed by it in turn. That is not a story about a single people. It is a story about many peoples, all of whom made the island what it is. Now, let us turn to something that sits at the intersection of ancient Britain's genetic history and the wider question of what the DNA is revealing about the mysterious cultures of prehistoric Europe, cultures whose legacies we are only beginning to appreciate. The people who built the megalithic monuments of the Atlantic world, from the passage tombs of Ireland to the stone circles of Britain, to the dolmens of Brittany, to the megalithic temples of Malta, were not a single culture in any simple sense. They spoke different languages. They had different specific burial practices and artistic traditions. But they were connected by a shared tradition of monumental architecture that spread along the Atlantic coast, and they were connected by the DNA they shared, the Anatolian-derived farmer ancestry that underlies all of them. What drove the construction of these monuments? This is a question that archaeologists have argued about for generations. The obvious answer, the one that fits most easily with what we know about human societies everywhere, is that these monuments were religious or ritual in nature. They were places where the dead were honored and where the living came to connect with ancestral forces. The alignment of many megalithic structures with astronomical events, solstices and equinoxes and lunar cycles, suggests that the people who built them had developed sophisticated knowledge of celestial movements and incorporated that knowledge into their ritual life. But the scale of these monuments is staggering. Newgrange in Ireland, built around 5,200 years ago, is older than the Egyptian pyramids. Its construction required the transport of around 200,000 tons of material. The passage tomb at Maeshowe in Orkney, aligned so precisely that on the winter solstice the setting sun shines directly down the entrance passage to illuminate the back wall of the chamber, represents an astronomical knowledge and a commitment of communal labor that still impresses modern engineers. These were not the products of simple or primitive societies. These were the products of complex, organized communities with sophisticated knowledge systems, strong social hierarchies, capable of commanding enormous collective effort, and a worldview that assigned enormous importance to the relationship between the living and the dead, and between the human world and the celestial world above it. The ancient DNA is now allowing us to begin understanding who these people were at an individual level. We can identify family groups within single monuments. We can track the movement of specific individuals or lineages across the landscape, and we are beginning to detect connections between monument-building communities across distances that tell us something important about the scale of the Atlantic world these people inhabited. Here is a finding that did not make major headlines when it was published, but that represents one of the more remarkable discoveries in the recent ancient DNA literature on Britain. Researchers analysing ancient genomes from Neolithic sites across the British Isles found genetic evidence suggesting that some individuals buried in Neolithic monuments in Britain were connected by ancestry to individuals buried in megalithic tombs in continental Europe, specifically in Brittany in northwestern France. The genetic similarities were specific enough to suggest not just shared cultural traditions or long-ago common ancestors, but actual relatively recent shared ancestry, people who were closely enough related that the connection could have been within a few generations. What this means is that the Atlantic megalithic world was not merely a shared cultural tradition that spread from community to community through diffusion and imitation. It was, at least in part, a world in which people were actually moving between communities across the open sea. People who were buried in monuments in Orkney or in Wales were closely enough related to people buried in Brittany that the connection must represent actual migration or at least regular long-distance movement of people. The Irish Sea and the English Channel and the Bay of Biscay were not barriers to the people of the Neolithic Atlantic world. They were highways. And the monuments they built along those highways were connected by something more than stylistic similarity. They were connected by blood. There is a word that comes up repeatedly in discussions of the ancient Atlantic world, a word that is simultaneously useful and contested. That word is Celtic. In popular usage, Celtic means a lot of things. It means the languages spoken in Ireland and Wales and Scotland and Brittany. It means a certain aesthetic tradition of swirling knotwork and illuminated manuscripts and jewelry of extraordinary complexity. It means a way of being in the world that some people associate with the Atlantic fringe, with storytelling and a particular relationship to landscape and memory. And in its older, more specific archaeological usage, it means the Iron Age cultures of Central and Western Europe, the Latin and Hallstatt cultures, whose artistic traditions spread widely and whose languages gave rise to the Celtic languages that survive today. The ancient DNA research is complicating the Celtic question in ways that are still actively debated. For most of the 20th century, the dominant view was that the Celtic languages came to Britain during the Iron Age, brought by Celtic-speaking peoples from Central Europe who migrated westward and northward and eventually reached the British Isles. This fitted neatly with the archaeological evidence of Iron Age cultural connections between Britain and continental Europe. But in recent years, some linguists and archaeologists have proposed a different model. They suggest that the Celtic languages may have reached Britain much earlier, possibly during the Bronze Age, possibly carried by the steppe-derived Beaker people, whose arrival so dramatically transformed the genetic makeup of the British Isles. Or even earlier still, possibly spread along the Atlantic coast during the Neolithic or Chalcolithic period by the megalithic farming communities who were moving so freely along the ocean routes. The ancient DNA cannot directly tell us what language any individual spoke. Language does not leave genetic traces in the way Ancestry does. But it can tell us when and how populations moved, and those movements can be compared with what the linguistic evidence suggests about when languages spread. And the genomic evidence for the early Bronze Age steppe expansion into Britain is now so strong that it has caused at least some researchers to take seriously the possibility that the Indo-European, and potentially specifically Celtic, language transition in Britain happened earlier than the traditional model assumed. This is not a settled question. It is a live debate. But the fact that ancient DNA is forcing us to reconsider the timing of fundamental linguistic transformations in British prehistory is itself a measure of how completely this new science is reshaping our understanding of the island's past. Let us turn now to a region of Britain that has a particularly strange relationship with its own genetic history. A region that has always been somewhat apart, somewhat different, somewhat resistant to the narrative of the rest of the island, the far southwest of England. Cornwall. Cornwall occupies a narrow peninsula jutting into the Atlantic at the southwestern tip of Britain. Its geography, surrounded on three sides by water and connected to the rest of England by a relatively narrow land corridor, has always given it a degree of isolation. Its language, Cornish, a Celtic language closely related to Welsh and Breton, survived in daily use until the 18th century, long after Celtic languages had disappeared from most of England, and has been revived as a living language in the 20th and 21st centuries through dedicated community effort. The ancient DNA of Cornwall is, as you might expect from its geography and history, somewhat different from the genetic profiles of other parts of England. Studies of medieval and early modern Cornish populations show higher levels of the genetic ancestry associated with the earlier British populations, the Iron Age and Romano-British communities, than is found in most of lowland England. The Anglo-Saxon migrations that so dramatically changed the genetic makeup of eastern England made less impact in the far southwest. And within Cornwall, there are still detectable differences between coastal communities and inland communities, between areas that were more or less connected to the trade networks of the Bronze Age Atlantic world. What Cornwall represents, in genetic terms, is another example of the edge effect that runs through the entire ancient DNA story of Britain. At the edges of the island, in the places most protected by geography, or most connected to the Atlantic maritime world, older genetic patterns persist with greater fidelity. The farther you get from the center, the more the DNA tells you about populations that were there before the great transforming waves of migration reached full force. There is something almost unbearably poignant about what the ancient DNA is revealing when we read it carefully and think about what it means for individual human lives. Every genome that scientists extract from an ancient skeleton represents a person, a real human being who lived and breathed and felt hunger and love and fear and grief. The skeleton in the museum case was once a child running across grass, an adult carrying a heavy load, an old person sitting by a fire telling stories to grandchildren. The DNA in their teeth and bones is the most intimate record they left behind, more intimate in many ways than anything else that has survived. We can tell from their genome not just where their ancestors came from, but in some cases what they looked like, whether they had the genetic variants for lighter or darker skin, for blue or brown eyes, for the ability to digest milk into adulthood, for the susceptibility to certain diseases. And we can see, sometimes with heartbreaking clarity, the mixing that happened. The individual who carries half their ancestry from the incoming steppe-derived Beaker people and half from the Neolithic farming communities that were already there. The person buried in a Bronze Age grave in central England, whose genome shows them to be the descendant of people from multiple, very different ancestral backgrounds. The Roman period individual in York, whose genome shows them to have had parents or grandparents from populations separated by thousands of miles. These people did not think of themselves in genomic terms. They thought of themselves as members of families and communities, and perhaps in some cases, of broader ethnic or political groups. But the DNA tells us that even in the deepest prehistory, even in the periods when the world was more fragmented and movement more difficult than it later became, people were meeting and mixing and producing children who carried the diversity of those meetings forward in time. Here is a question that sits at the heart of the ancient DNA research in Britain, and that does not yet have a satisfying answer. Why did the early Neolithic farmers so completely replace the indigenous hunter-gatherers? We have established that this replacement happened. We have established that it was rapid, by evolutionary standards, occurring within a few generations in many parts of Britain. We know it was not followed by significant genetic continuity of the hunter-gatherer populations in most of the country, but we do not know why. The most obvious hypothesis is epidemic disease. When the Neolithic farmers arrived from continental Europe, they brought with them not just new food production technologies, but new diseases associated with living in close proximity to domestic animals and in denser communities than the hunter-gatherers were accustomed to. The hunter-gatherers, never having been exposed to these pathogens, would have had no immunity. A series of epidemic disease events could have catastrophically reduced their numbers in a way that left little genetic trace. We have evidence from later in history of how devastating epidemic disease can be when it strikes a population without immunity. The arrival of European diseases in the Americas after Columbus killed far more indigenous people than any act of deliberate violence. Estimates range widely, but some scholars believe that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the first century after European contact, primarily from disease. If something similar happened to the indigenous hunter-gatherers of Britain when the Neolithic farmers arrived, it would explain both the speed of the replacement and the completeness of it. But this remains a hypothesis. Ancient DNA can tell us about ancestry. It cannot directly tell us about the causes of demographic events. To get at the disease question, researchers would need to extract ancient pathogen DNA from the same sites and the same time periods, looking for the genetic signatures of diseases that might have been new to the hunter-gatherers. That kind of research is being done, but it is technically demanding and the results so far are incomplete. Another hypothesis involves violence. The Neolithic farmers who arrived in Britain came from communities that had already spent thousands of years in the competitive environment of agricultural Europe, where resource competition between settled communities could and did lead to organized violence. There is archaeological evidence from continental Europe of Neolithic massacres, entire communities killed and buried together in events that look, from the archaeological record, very much like warfare or genocide. The Aspan-Schletz site in Austria, the Talheim death pit in Germany. Multiple sites where dozens of individuals were killed and dumped together in ways that could not represent anything other than organized collective violence. Did the arriving Neolithic farmers kill the hunter-gatherers of Britain? We cannot say with certainty. But the absence of large massacre sites from this period in Britain does not necessarily mean violence did not occur. Massacre sites are rare even in periods we know to have been violent, and the genetic signature of replacement is consistent with what we might expect if violence played a significant role. The honest position is that we do not yet know what mechanism or combination of mechanisms produced the near-total genetic replacement of the indigenous British hunter-gatherers. We know it happened. We do not yet know why. And the why matters enormously, not just as a matter of historical accuracy, but because the mechanisms of that replacement speak to fundamental questions about human nature and human history and the way that societies in contact with each other behave. Let us talk about Doggerland again, because there is a dimension to the Doggerland story that rarely gets mentioned, and that the ancient DNA research is beginning to illuminate from the edges. Doggerland, the landmass that connected Britain to continental Europe across what is now the southern North Sea, was inhabited for thousands of years. It had rivers and forests and meadows and wetlands. It supported communities of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who fished its rivers and hunted its game, and who, from what we can reconstruct, had complex and rich material cultures. We know this because occasionally, in the nets of fishing boats trawling the southern North Sea, fragments of Doggerland come up from the seabed, animal bones, pieces of worked wood, and occasionally human remains. The DNA from these deep-sea Doggerland finds is extraordinarily difficult to extract because the material has been in salt water for thousands of years and the preservation is challenging. But researchers are making attempts, and in some cases succeeding in getting partial genomic information from these marine-preserved ancient humans. What they are finding, so far, is consistent with what we would expect, given everything else we know about the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Northern Europe. These were people with the genetic profiles characteristic of the Western European hunter-gatherer populations, broadly similar to Cheddar Man, but the specific profiles of Doggerland individuals, where they can be determined, add data points to a map of Mesolithic population structure that we are only beginning to draw. Why does this matter? Because Doggerland was not just a land bridge. It was a habitat, a home for a substantial population. When Doggerland was swallowed by the sea, that population did not disappear entirely. They went somewhere. Some went east into what is now the Netherlands and Germany, some went north into Scandinavia, and some went west, into the island that Britain was becoming, adding their particular genetic profiles to the already complex mixture of the island's hunter-gatherer populations. The flooding of Doggerland was one of the most significant demographic events in the prehistoric North Sea world, and it happened right at the time when the Neolithic farmers were beginning their Atlantic expansion. The people displaced by the sea flooding their homeland were colliding, genetically and perhaps physically, with the people arriving from the south and east, with new agricultural technologies and new pathogens. The chaos of that intersection, the meeting and sometimes violent collision of multiple displaced and moving populations, may itself have contributed to the speed and completeness of the demographic transformations that followed. There is a site in Somerset, in southwest England, that has been producing extraordinary finds for decades and that deserves a sustained moment of attention. It is called the Sweet Track. It is a raised wooden walkway, constructed from felled alder and ash and oak trees, that once crossed a boggy wetland called the Somerset Levels. The Sweet Track was built in a single year, around 3800 BCE, and it is one of the oldest engineered roads in the world. The people who built the Sweet Track were among the earliest Neolithic farmers of Britain. They were, based on the ancient DNA evidence from contemporary sites in the region, overwhelmingly descended from the Anatolian-derived farming populations that had spread up the Atlantic coast from Iberia and Brittany. They were not the indigenous hunter-gatherers of Britain. They were the newcomers, the migrants, the people who had crossed the sea from continental Europe carrying their seeds and their animals and their traditions of monument building and their new ways of organizing communities. And yet the Sweet Track, for all its modernity relative to the hunter-gatherer occupation that preceded it, was built in a landscape that had been inhabited for thousands of years before these farmers arrived. The wetlands of the Somerset Levels were rich in resources that hunter-gatherers had exploited long before anyone planted a field or herded a sheep there. And the people who built the Sweet Track were not building in an empty landscape. They were building in a landscape that had already been shaped by human presence for generations. The Sweet Track has never yielded human remains, so we cannot directly compare the genetics of its builders with the hunter-gatherers who came before them. But the material culture found alongside it, The pots and axes and arrows, and the single beautifully crafted wooden paddle that was found near one of the posts, tells a story of a community in transition. People who were using new agricultural technologies, but who were also still fishing the wetlands and gathering the wild resources that had sustained people there for millennia. This is a pattern that the ancient DNA is increasingly suggesting may be more common than the simple replacement narrative implies. In some cases, particularly in areas with specific ecological resources that farmers did not immediately have the technology or knowledge to fully exploit, hunter-gatherers and farmers may have existed alongside each other for longer than the genetic data at a population level suggests. The replacement was real, but it may have been preceded, in some areas, by a period of coexistence and interaction that left minimal genetic traces, but significant cultural ones. The ancient DNA of Britain is also beginning to tell us something about something we rarely think of as a subject for genetic investigation: status, power, hierarchy. We have already mentioned the finding of first-degree incest in high-status Neolithic burials, but that is just one aspect of a broader finding that is emerging from multiple studies. In many prehistoric populations, the distribution of genetic ancestry is not random across the social hierarchy, as inferred from burial wealth and monument location. Elite burials, the ones with the most elaborate grave goods, the ones positioned most centrally within the largest monuments, tend to show specific genetic profiles that differ from the general population. In the Bronze Age period especially, there is evidence that certain ancestry types were associated with high status. Individuals buried with wealth, with metal weapons and ornaments, with evidence of feasting and complex ritual, tend to show genetic profiles that have higher proportions of steppe-derived ancestry than the surrounding population. This suggests that in early Bronze Age Britain, the elite, the people who commanded the resources to build monuments and accumulate wealth and be buried with ceremony, were disproportionately descended from the incoming steppe populations that had arrived a few centuries earlier. What this implies is that the steppe-derived beaker migrants did not simply arrive and blend equally into the existing population. They arrived and, in many cases, established themselves as an elite, a ruling class whose status and power were reinforced across generations by preferential marriage practices and the concentration of wealth in certain lineages. The ancient DNA is allowing us to see, for the first time, the genetic structure of prehistoric social hierarchy. And what it shows is that inequality and inherited elite status are far older in Britain than any written record can tell us. This is a good moment to think about what all of this means for the stories we tell ourselves about history. Because every human society tells stories about its origins. Every group of people has, in one form or another, a founding narrative, a myth of where they came from and why they belong where they are. These stories are not simply false, exactly. They encode real memories, real connections to place and ancestry. But they are always incomplete, always selective, always shaped by the needs of the people who tell them. The ancient DNA research is not destroying these stories, but it is adding to them, layering a new dimension of complexity and depth beneath them. When someone in Wales says that their Celtic ancestors have been in Britain since time immemorial, the DNA tells a story that is simultaneously true and deeply complicated. The Celtic cultural and linguistic traditions of Wales do have deep roots in the British landscape, but the people who carry those traditions are themselves the products of multiple waves of migration and transformation, going back through the steppe expansion and the Neolithic farming arrival and the post-glacial recolonization to the African origins of all modern humans. The DNA does not belong to any one group. It belongs to everyone whose ancestors passed through a particular place at a particular time. And in Britain, over the vast sweep of time that the ancient DNA record now covers, almost every kind of human being who has ever existed on the western edge of Europe has, at some point, passed through. There is a final mystery in the ancient DNA of Britain that has only recently come to light, and that represents one of the most genuinely puzzling findings of recent years. When researchers analyze the genomes of individuals from the period of Roman Britain, specifically from the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, they occasionally find individuals who do not fit any of the expected ancestral profiles. Not Romano-British, not recent continental migrants from the Germanic world, not North African or Eastern Mediterranean in the way that garrison troops from those regions would be. something else. Something that does not map cleanly onto any known ancient population. These anomalous individuals are not common. They appear as outliers in datasets, individuals whose genomes contain combinations of ancestry that the existing reference populations cannot fully explain. In some cases, they carry small but detectable proportions of ancestry that appears, tentatively and controversially, to trace to populations far to the east, beyond the known boundaries of the Roman world. Could Roman period Britain have had contacts, through intermediaries, or through the long chains of trade that connected the Roman world to Central Asia and China along the Silk Road, with populations so distant that their genetic traces ended up in individuals buried on the edge of the British Isles? It seems almost impossible, and yet the anomalous genomes are there in the data, and they require an explanation. The most likely explanations are mundane ones: genetic drift in small populations, statistical artifacts of incomplete reference databases, contamination, sampling biases. But the possibility that these outlier genomes reflect genuine long-distance connections, people who traveled extraordinary distances to reach the furthest northwestern edge of the Roman world, cannot be entirely dismissed. And the history of ancient DNA research is full of examples of findings that seemed impossible and turned out to be real. We are coming now to something that connects the deep genetic history of Britain with questions about pre-Columbian North America in a way that is less speculative than anything we have discussed so far. Not because the answer is known, but because the questions are becoming more precisely defined and the tools to answer them are rapidly improving. The ancient population of the British Isles, specifically during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, was connected to a broader Atlantic world that stretched from northern Morocco to the southernmost tip of Scandinavia. Along this Atlantic facade, communities shared genetic ancestry, shared cultural traditions, shared astronomical knowledge, and traded across open water. We know this from the ancient DNA, from the archaeology of megalithic monuments, from the distribution of specific types of stone and metal. The Norse are known to have reached North America. Leif Erikson's settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, dated to around 1000 CE, is the best documented pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas. The Norse who reached Newfoundland were themselves the descendants of people who carried ancestry that traced, through long chains of connection and mixing, back to the populations of Scandinavia, and ultimately to the same broad genetic pool of northern European populations that includes the populations of ancient Britain. But the Norse did not appear from nowhere. They were the maritime heirs of a tradition of North Atlantic seafaring that went back much further. The people who populated Iceland, which the Norse reached in the 9th century, were themselves preceded by Irish monks, evidence of whom survives in the written records of early Norse settlers who reported finding Irish objects and books when they arrived. And those Irish monks were themselves the heirs of a maritime tradition stretching back through the Bronze Age and the Neolithic. How far back does the tradition of North Atlantic seafaring go? When did people first venture far enough north and west along the Atlantic edge to begin encountering the possibility of reaching North America via the island-hopping route through the Faroe Islands and Iceland and Greenland? We do not know. The ancient DNA and the archaeology do not yet give us a clear answer, but the question is being taken seriously by researchers who are asking it not as myth or speculation, but as genuine historical inquiry. Here is what we do know, with a degree of confidence that is increasing as more ancient DNA is analysed. The genetic history of the British Isles, when read carefully and completely, tells a story of a place that has been shaped, again and again, by the arrival of new peoples from across the water. The sea has not been a barrier to Britain. It has been a gateway. The island has accumulated, layer by layer, the genetic contributions of hunter-gatherers returning from Ice Age refuges, Neolithic farmers crossing from Brittany and Iberia, steppe-derived beaker people pushing westward, Iron Age communities maintaining Atlantic connections, Roman garrison troops drawn from across the empire, Anglo-Saxons from the continental North Sea coast, Norse settlers from Scandinavia, Normans from northern France, and the countless smaller movements of people that the historical record names or fails to name. Every one of these arrivals left traces in the DNA of the people who came after them. Some of those traces are large and clear, legible even in the population-level statistics of modern genetic surveys. Others are small and subtle, detectable only in the detailed analysis of ancient genomes from specific sites and periods. But none of them is entirely gone. All of them persist, in fragments and echoes, in the cells of people living in Britain today. What does it feel like to know this? To know that you carry in your body the accumulated genetic history of people who lived 10,000 years ago, who built monuments that still stand, who crossed seas in boats we would struggle to reconstruct, who survived ice ages and epidemics and conquest and displacement, and whose DNA has persisted through all of it to the present. For some people, this knowledge is disorienting. It dissolves the simple stories they had told themselves about who they are and where they came from. The Cornish person who thought they were the direct genetic heir of the ancient Celts discovers that their Celtic linguistic ancestors were themselves newcomers who transformed an earlier population. The English person who thought their identity was rooted in Anglo-Saxon origins discovers that those Anglo-Saxon migrations were layered on top of multiple earlier transformations that the DNA makes visible. But for other people, this knowledge is liberating. It reveals that the question of who belongs in Britain, of who has a legitimate claim to connection with the island and its history, cannot be answered by biology alone. The DNA shows not a single ancestral people, but a continuous process of becoming. Not a fixed identity rooted in ancient blood, but a dynamic, always changing, always accumulating inheritance. The people of Britain today are not the result of a single founding population. They are the result of thousands of years of arrival and mixing and change. And the ancient DNA research, by making that process visible in unprecedented detail, is giving everyone who cares about the island's past a much richer and more honest version of the story to inhabit. There is a particular ancient individual whose story captures something essential about what the ancient DNA research is revealing. They were buried in what is now the city of York, sometime around the 3rd or 4th century CE, during the Roman occupation of Britain. Their burial was not extraordinary by the standards of Roman York, a significant provincial capital with a substantial and diverse population. They were laid out in the Roman fashion, with a few grave goods that suggest modest but not negligible status. When the DNA was extracted and analyzed, it revealed a genome that was genuinely surprising. This individual carried ancestry from multiple, very different regions. Their paternal lineage, traceable through the Y chromosome, was consistent with Roman military populations from the Mediterranean world. Their maternal ancestry, traceable through the mitochondrial DNA, showed connections to populations from the Eastern Mediterranean or possibly the Middle East. But they also carried a small but detectable proportion of ancestry, consistent with the indigenous British populations that had been present in the island for thousands of years before the Romans arrived. This person was, in their own body, a summary of the Roman world, a product of the empire's extraordinary capacity to move people and mix populations and create something genuinely new from the ingredients it brought together. They had ancestors from possibly 3 different continents. They had lived and died in a cold northwestern province 1,000 miles from Rome, and their bones, after more than 1,000 years in the earth, are now telling their story to researchers who could not have imagined, when they began their work, that this particular story was waiting to be found. The ancient DNA of Britain is not finished revealing its secrets. Every year, new studies appear with new findings. New ancient genomes are sequenced, new comparisons are made. New models are built and tested and revised. Some of the most significant work still to be done concerns the periods and regions where the data is currently thinnest. The Scottish Highlands, where preservation conditions are often poor and where relatively little ancient DNA has been extracted. The far southwest of England and the Channel Islands, where the Atlantic connections of the prehistoric world were most intense. The Iron Age and early medieval periods, where the political and cultural transformations are well documented in the historical and archaeological record, but the genetic underpinning is still being mapped. And there is the question of what might be called the invisible migrations, the people who came and went and left genetic traces too faint or too mixed to be clearly attributable to any specific source population. The traders and travelers and missionaries and slaves and soldiers who moved across the Roman world and the Viking world and the medieval world in ways that left no written record but that show up, sometimes, as unexpected ancestry signals in the genomes of people who appear in the archaeological record. Every one of these invisible migrants was a real person. They had a name, probably, and a community, and a language, and a life story that was as complex and particular as your own. The ancient DNA can only tell us about their ancestry, but it tells us that they were there, that they lived, that they contributed something, however small, to the genetic inheritance of the people who came after them. There is something humbling about standing at the edge of what this research has revealed and looking out at all that remains unknown. The human story is incomprehensibly deep. 300,000 years of modern Homo sapiens, more than 1 million years of earlier humans on the landscape that eventually became Britain, millions of individual lives, each one as complex and fully realized as your own, stretching back through time in a chain of parents and children that extends from the present moment all the way back to the African savanna where our species first emerged. The ancient DNA research is illuminating small fragments of that story with extraordinary precision. But it is also revealing, more clearly than any previous method, how much remains in the dark, how many migrations are not yet detected, how many population transformations occurred in places where preservation conditions make ancient DNA recovery impossible, how many individual lives left no genetic trace at all, swallowed by the normal randomness of inheritance and extinction that means most lineages eventually terminate. Britain is a small island, but its genetic history is vast. And the scientists, who are slowly extracting and sequencing and analyzing the ancient DNA of its inhabitants, are engaged in one of the most genuinely important intellectual projects of our time. Not because it will change anything about the present, not because it will settle any political argument or validate any particular claim to identity or belonging, but because it is telling us, with increasing clarity and specificity, who we have been. And knowing who we have been is part of understanding who we are. The bones in the museum do not speak. The fragments of enamel and collagen that yield their DNA to laboratory extraction do not narrate their own stories. They are silent, as all the truly ancient dead are silent, waiting for us to develop the tools and the patience and the intelligence to hear what they have to say. But when we do hear it, when we extract the 3 billion base pairs of a human genome from a fragment of ancient tissue and compare it to the genomes of other ancient individuals and to the genomes of living people, what we hear is extraordinary. We hear about migrations across continents and oceans. We hear about epidemics and replacements and mixings that transformed populations in the space of a few generations. We hear about elite lineages that maintained their genetic distinctiveness through deliberate practice across centuries. We hear about individuals who traveled enormous distances from their places of origin to live and die at the edge of the world their ancestors knew. And we hear, underneath all of it, the same story that is told by every kind of evidence we have about the deep human past. The story of a restless, curious, adaptable species that has never stayed still, that has always moved toward the horizon, that has always, in the end, been shaped by its encounters with people different from itself. The ancient DNA of Britain is not the story of any single people. It is the story of all the peoples who ever came to that island and left their traces in the bodies of those who came after them. That story is still being written. Every ancient genome extracted is a new sentence in it, and every sentence reveals something that no one quite expected. Here, in the growing quiet of wherever you are tonight, with the stories of these ancient people settling into the space around you, there is something worth resting with before sleep comes. The chain that connects you to all of this is unbroken. You may live far from Britain. You may have ancestors from places whose ancient DNA has not yet been studied in detail. But the story of human movement and mixing and transformation that ancient DNA is making visible in Britain is the same story, in broad outline, that would be visible everywhere if the evidence were equally recoverable. The people who live in any place today are the descendants of people who came from somewhere else. And those people were themselves the descendants of people who came from somewhere else before that. Going back and back and back through the whole length of human time until the chain reaches the small population in Africa from whom all living humans descend, we are all newcomers, if the timescale is long enough. We are all the products of mixing and encounter and transformation. We all carry in ourselves the traces of people we will never know, whose names are lost, whose stories are lost, but whose DNA has persisted, against all the odds of history and time, to flow through us, and eventually into the people who will come after us. The island sits in the grey Atlantic, battered by wind, older than anyone who has ever lived on it. And in the bones beneath its soil, the story continues to wait for the questions that have not yet been asked, and the tools that have not yet been invented, and the researchers who have not yet been born, to come and read what is written there. If this journey through deep time and ancient mystery has kept your mind gently wandering while your eyes grow heavy, then it has done exactly what it was meant to do. You can tap like if you would like more stories like this one. You can subscribe to travel together through these long, slow explorations of the past that most history books never reach. I would genuinely love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. A city with its orange electric glow, a countryside where the stars are still clear, a room in a place that carries its own layer of ancient history beneath the modern surface. Leave a comment if you feel like it. Just a city, a time, a thought. And if you feel moved to support the work of making these long explorations possible, there is a membership here on YouTube, completely optional. Watching and listening and resting here is already more than enough. For now, there is nothing to do. The ancient migrations are over. The replacements and the mixings and the extraordinary journeys across ice and water are finished for tonight. All that remains is the quiet, the breathing, the slow softening of consciousness as the day releases its grip. The bones in the earth beneath Britain are still. The scientists will return to their laboratories tomorrow. The questions will keep accumulating. But tonight you can let all of it settle into whatever half-dreamed landscape your sleeping mind is already beginning to build. The same stars that crossed over Cheddar Man 9,000 years ago are crossing overhead right now. The same deep time that holds all of those ancient migrations in its enormous patience holds you too. And if you listen very quietly, somewhere beneath the sound of your own breathing, you might almost hear the echo of all those footsteps, all those arrivals, all those lives, flowing forward through time to reach the moment when you are here and alive and listening. Rest now. The ancient dead have been patient for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer while you sleep. End of script. Something that rarely gets mentioned in the popular accounts of ancient British genetics is the sheer technical difficulty of the work that produces these findings. It is worth pausing to appreciate this, because the difficulty shapes everything about what we know and what we do not yet know. Ancient DNA is degraded DNA. When a person dies, the enzymes within their own cells begin breaking down their genetic material almost immediately. Bacteria and fungi continue the process. The physical and chemical environment, temperature, humidity, acidity, the presence or absence of oxygen, all affect how quickly and how completely the DNA breaks down over time. Under ideal conditions, such as permafrost or very dry caves, fragments of DNA can survive for hundreds of thousands of years. Under poor conditions, such as warm, wet, acidic soils, DNA can be completely unrecoverable within a few thousand years. Britain, unfortunately, has some of the worst preservation conditions on Earth for ancient DNA. The island's climate is damp, its soils are often acidic. Much of its ancient human burial record comes from sites where preservation is variable and often poor. This means that for every ancient British genome that has been successfully sequenced, there are dozens of skeletons from which no usable DNA could be recovered at all. Researchers working on British ancient DNA are therefore always working with incomplete data. They are constructing their picture of the population history of the island from a sample that is not random, but is biased toward individuals who happen to be buried in conditions that allowed some DNA to survive. This introduces potential biases that researchers are keenly aware of and work hard to account for. But it means that every conclusion from the ancient DNA of Britain comes with an asterisk. We are seeing a partial picture. The full picture may be even more complex than what the surviving evidence shows. The extraction of ancient DNA from skeletal material requires extraordinary care to avoid contamination. The great enemy of ancient DNA research is modern human DNA. Every researcher who handles an ancient skeleton, every archaeologist who excavates a burial, every museum curator who has touched a bone, leaves traces of their own DNA on the surface of the material. Without meticulous precautions, that modern DNA can overwhelm the ancient signal and produce results that reflect the researchers themselves rather than the individuals they are trying to study. Modern ancient DNA laboratories look like something from a science fiction film. They are clean rooms where air pressure is carefully maintained to prevent outside air from entering. Researchers wear full body suits and double gloves and face shields. Every surface is decontaminated before and after use. The extraction process is conducted in physical isolation from the sequencing process, because the amplified fragments that come out of sequencing contain modern DNA that could contaminate the extraction facilities. Even with all of these precautions, contamination is a real risk that must be constantly monitored and tested for. Part of the reason that ancient DNA findings require independent replication before they are accepted by the scientific community is precisely this contamination concern. If two independent laboratories, using different samples from the same burial site, produce the same genomic results, the chance that both have been contaminated in the same way is vanishingly small. Replication is the safeguard against contamination that can make results seem real when they are actually artifacts. There is a specific region of Britain whose ancient DNA story is only now beginning to be properly investigated, and whose findings are likely to be among the most significant of the coming decade. That region is the Thames estuary and the surrounding lowlands of southeastern England. The Thames Valley was, throughout the prehistoric period, one of the most densely inhabited parts of Britain. Its combination of fertile river terraces, abundant fresh water, and access to both the interior of the island and the open sea made it attractive to every wave of incoming population that we have discussed. The hunter-gatherers who recolonized Britain after the last ice age used it. The Neolithic farmers who arrived from the continent settled it densely. The Beaker people established themselves along it. The Bronze Age communities that followed used it as a highway. The Iron Age peoples built their oppidum, their proto-urban settlements, on its banks. The Romans made it the central artery of their provincial administration, building Londinium at the point where the river could most conveniently be bridged. But the Thames Valley is also a place where preservation conditions for ancient DNA are notoriously difficult. The waterlogged sediments that preserve wooden objects and plant material beautifully are often too chemically complex for DNA survival. The gravel terraces where most ancient burials are found are well drained and acidic and often poor for genetic preservation. Despite these challenges, researchers are beginning to successfully extract ancient DNA from Thames Valley individuals. And what they are finding is confirming and complicating the broader picture of British prehistory in equal measure. The Neolithic farmers of the Thames Valley show ancestry profiles consistent with the general pattern of Anatolian-derived farming expansion into Britain. But there are individual outliers, people whose genomic profiles suggest ancestry connections that are not immediately explicable by the dominant population movements of their period. People who may represent smaller, less well-documented movements of individuals or small groups. These outliers are, as always in ancient DNA research, the most interesting data points. Not because they overturn the general picture, which they do not, but because they remind us that human population movements are never clean and simple. Alongside the major waves of migration that the genetics make so clearly visible, there were always smaller movements, individual journeys, family dispersals, trading connections that brought people from unexpected places into communities where their ancestry was unusual. The Thames Valley outliers are a reminder of the ceaseless, restless movement of human beings that the big-picture population genetics can never fully capture. Let us think carefully about a detail that often gets lost in the excitement over the dramatic population replacement events in British prehistory. Let us think about what continuity means, and where it appears in the ancient DNA record, even when the overall pattern shows dramatic change. Even after the Neolithic replacement of the indigenous hunter-gatherers, there were individuals who carried traces of that older ancestry. The proportions were tiny. In most of Britain, the genetic signal of the indigenous hunter-gatherers effectively disappears within a few generations of the Neolithic farmers' arrival, but it does not disappear entirely. In some individuals, some regions, some specific community contexts, tiny fragments of that pre-farming heritage persisted. What does this tell us? It tells us that even the most dramatic demographic replacements in prehistory were not absolute. There were individuals who survived the replacement, who found some way to be incorporated into the new communities rather than dying out or being killed. Perhaps they had skills that the incoming farmers valued. Perhaps they formed relationships of some kind with the newcomers. Perhaps in areas that the farmers initially bypassed or could not easily reach, small groups of hunter-gatherers held on for a few more generations before ultimately being absorbed into the surrounding farming population. The persistence of tiny fragments of older ancestry within populations that were overwhelmingly transformed is one of the most consistent patterns in the ancient DNA of Britain. It appears after the Neolithic transition. It appears after the Beaker transition. It appears after the Anglo-Saxon migrations, where Romano-British ancestry persists even in the communities most heavily influenced by incoming continental populations. It is as if something of the previous inhabitants always survives, however small, threading itself through the successive transformations to contribute something, however tiny, to what comes next. This is not just a genetic observation. It is a statement about the nature of demographic change and the resilience of human communities. Even in the worst historical catastrophes, some individuals survive. Some lineages persist. The thread is never entirely cut, and the ancient DNA gives us, for the first time, the resolution to see those threads, where they persist, in the interstices of the great waves of change. Here is something that happened in the British ancient DNA record that has not yet received the attention it deserves outside specialist literature, and that speaks to questions about the nature of identity and belonging in prehistoric Britain that are more relevant to our own world than they might initially appear. When researchers analysed ancient genomes from early Bronze Age Britain, the period immediately following the arrival of the Beaker migrants, who so dramatically transformed the island's genetic makeup, they found something unexpected. Within the new, predominantly steppe-derived Bronze Age population, there was a relatively rapid development of regional genetic differentiation. Groups that had arrived as part of the same broad Beaker migration were, within a few centuries, developing distinct regional genetic profiles. Northern Britain showed one pattern, Southern Britain showed another, Western Britain yet another. This regional differentiation was not random. It reflected, in part, the existing geographic structure of the island. The mountains and rivers and coastlines that divided Britain into natural regions also, evidently, divided the populations that lived in those regions in ways that limited interbreeding between geographically separated communities. The result was that even a population that had arrived relatively recently and been relatively genetically uniform was, within a few centuries, developing the kind of regional variation that would eventually, over many subsequent millennia, contribute to the complex regional identities and cultural differences that have always characterized Britain. This finding suggests something important about human population dynamics more generally. Genetic homogeneity, even in populations that have recently been derived from a single source, is unstable. Geography and culture and chance all work to fragment it. And once fragmented, the resulting regional variation can persist for a surprisingly long time, surviving subsequent waves of migration and mixing without being entirely erased. The regional differences in modern British genetic profiles, the patterns of ancestry that differ between Orkney and Yorkshire and Wales and Cornwall, are not simply the result of the most recent episodes of migration. They reflect a much deeper history of geographic subdivision, of populations separated by natural barriers, maintaining their distinctiveness over centuries and millennia. Ancient DNA is beginning to allow researchers to trace those regional patterns back through time to see how deep they go and when they first emerged. The practice of isotopic analysis, which is related to, but distinct from ancient DNA, is providing another dimension of information about ancient British populations that complements the genetic findings in fascinating ways. Isotopes are variants of chemical elements that differ in their atomic weight. Different isotopes of strontium, oxygen, lead, and other elements are found in different proportions in different geographic regions, depending on the underlying geology of the landscape. When a person eats and drinks, they incorporate the isotopes from the local environment into their teeth and bones. The isotopic signature of teeth, which form during childhood, reflects the environment where a person grew up. The isotopic signature of bones, which continuously remodel throughout life, reflects the environment where a person lived in the years before death. By comparing the isotopic signatures of teeth and bones in the same individual, researchers can determine whether a person was born and grew up in the place where they were buried. If the signatures match the local geology, they were probably a local person. If they differ, the person probably spent their childhood in a different geological environment, which can sometimes be matched to specific regions. Isotopic analysis of Romano-British individuals in York, the city we have already discussed, has confirmed the genetic finding that the population was remarkably diverse in its origins. Many individuals in the Roman period burial record have isotopic signatures consistent with local British environments, but a significant minority show signatures that indicate childhood spent in warmer, more southerly environments consistent with North Africa or the Mediterranean, or in geological environments consistent with specific parts of continental Europe. These two independent lines of evidence, genetics and isotopes, pointing to the same conclusion about the diversity of Roman Britain, make that conclusion more robust. It is not just what the DNA suggests, it is also what the chemistry of their own bones confirms. These people came from far away, grew up in distant lands, and ended their lives in the grey northwestern province at the edge of the world their empire had built. The question of why ancient DNA research matters beyond academic curiosity is one that different people answer differently. For some, the value is purely intellectual. Understanding where we came from, how the human population of the British Isles was assembled from its component parts, is intrinsically fascinating, in the same way that understanding the deep structure of the universe is intrinsically fascinating. We are curious creatures, and understanding our own origins is one of the most fundamental expressions of that curiosity. For others, the value is more personal. The growing availability of commercial DNA testing has given millions of people access to information about their own ancestry that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. And while the direct DNA tests that commercial companies offer analyze modern genomes rather than ancient ones, the reference frameworks developed by ancient DNA researchers are essential for interpreting those results. When a commercial testing company tells you that you have 20% Scandinavian ancestry or 15% Iberian ancestry, those categories are defined in large part by the ancient DNA research that has identified the genetic signatures of historical populations. For yet others, the value is political, and this is where things become complicated. Ancient DNA has been invoked in arguments about national identity, about immigration, about who belongs in various countries and regions. As we have already noted, these uses of the science almost always involve distorting or selectively reading the findings. But the existence of these distortions does not make the science itself less valuable. It makes it more important that accurate and nuanced versions of the findings are communicated as widely as possible. The honest message of ancient DNA research about Britain and about every other part of the world where it has been applied is not that any particular group has a special claim to belonging. The honest message is that human populations are always in motion, always mixing, always changing. There is no pure ancestral state to which any group can claim privileged connection. There is only the long, complicated, beautiful, and sometimes violent process of people moving across the landscape of the world and shaping and being shaped by what they find when they get there. Let us return to something we touched on briefly earlier and explore it in more depth. The question of what happened to the indigenous languages of Britain before the arrival of the Indo-European speaking farmers and steppe migrants. We know that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who inhabited Britain after the last ice age had language. All anatomically modern human populations have language, but we have no idea what their languages were like, because languages, unlike DNA, leave no physical traces in the archaeological record except in the specific form of writing, which does not appear in Britain until the Roman period. Everything that can be said about pre-Indo-European languages in Britain is inference rather than direct evidence. There is one tantalizing possibility that linguists have discussed, with varying degrees of enthusiasm and skepticism, for many decades. Some researchers have suggested that certain place names in Britain, particularly the names of rivers, preserve traces of very ancient languages that predate the arrival of Indo-European speakers on the island. River names in particular tend to be extraordinarily conservative. When new linguistic communities take over a landscape, they often adopt the existing names for rivers and other prominent geographical features slightly adapting them to fit the phonology of their own language while preserving something of the original form. Some British river names appear to resist analysis in terms of any known language: the Thames, the Severn, the Exe. These names can be shown to derive from very old forms, earlier even than the Celtic languages that are themselves very old in Britain. Whether they preserve traces of pre-Indo-European languages spoken in Britain before the Beaker transition is debated. The evidence is fragmentary, and the arguments are technical. But the possibility that these river names are echoes of languages spoken by people whose genetic descendants were almost entirely replaced, languages that have no other surviving traces, is both poignant and scientifically interesting. The ancient DNA cannot directly contribute to this question. But by establishing when and how thoroughly the pre-Indo-European populations of Britain were replaced, it helps define the window in which those older languages must have survived. If the hunter-gatherers of Britain were almost entirely replaced by Neolithic farmers within a few generations, then their languages, if they survived at all, survived only in small communities and for a limited time before being subsumed by whatever languages the Neolithic farmers brought with them. If those Neolithic farmer languages were then similarly replaced by the Indo-European languages of the Beaker migrants, then the chain of linguistic transmission that might have preserved Mesolithic language features is very long and very attenuated. But river names are remarkably durable. If any trace of the most ancient British languages survives, it is in those names, and every time someone mentions the Thames, they may, unknowingly, be pronouncing a syllable that was first formed in the mouths of people who left only the faintest genetic shadows in the living populations of the island. The connection between ancient British DNA and the wider story of pre-Columbian North America is one that requires us to think carefully about what we mean by evidence and what kinds of evidence are appropriate for what kinds of questions. The Norse settlement of North America is documented. It is not controversial. The archaeology of L'Anse-aux-Meadows has established beyond any reasonable doubt that Norse people from Iceland, people whose ancestry traced ultimately to Scandinavia and to the same broad northern European genetic pool as the ancient Britons, established a settlement in Newfoundland around 1,000 years ago. They were there. They interacted, sometimes violently, with the indigenous people they called Skraelings. They ultimately withdrew, but they were there. What is less clear, and what is genuinely debated among researchers who take the question seriously, is whether there were earlier crossings. Whether the tradition of North Atlantic voyaging that the Norse inherited from their predecessors went back further than the Viking Age, and whether those earlier voyagers, Irish monks, or Atlantic Bronze Age, maritime communities, or others whose names we do not know, may have reached North America before the Norse. The genetic evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Old World and the Americas is currently thin. The Polynesian connection to South America is the only case that is broadly accepted, and that was a Pacific crossing, not an Atlantic one. For the Atlantic, the evidence is limited to suggestive but contested signals in the genomes of some indigenous North American populations, signals that may or may not represent genuine ancient Old World ancestry. But this is an area of active research, and the ancient DNA of Britain is relevant to it, because if Old World populations did reach North America before Columbus, the populations of the Atlantic fringe of Europe, including Britain and Ireland, are among the most plausible candidates for who those populations were. They were the maritime specialists of the Atlantic world. They were the ones who built boats and crossed open water regularly as part of their normal cultural practice. If anyone from the Old World was in North America before the Norse, it was more likely to be people from the Atlantic edge than from anywhere else. The honest assessment of where this research stands is that we do not know whether pre-Columbian Atlantic contact occurred. The evidence is insufficient to establish it as fact, but it is also insufficient to definitively rule it out. And as ancient DNA research improves, as more ancient North American genomes are sequenced, and as the analytical tools for detecting faint and ancient signals of population mixing improve, the question will become answerable in ways that it is not yet. Something that the ancient DNA research has revealed about the deep history of Britain connects, in a roundabout way, to questions about the nature of memory and how information persists across time in human cultures. The genetic signature of the Neolithic farmers in Britain is largely derived from Anatolian populations who arrived around 6,000 years ago. Those farmers brought with them, presumably, their languages and their stories and their mythologies and their understanding of the cosmos. What happened to those cultural traditions over the subsequent millennia? We cannot know directly, but there are hints in the archaeological and anthropological record that suggest some elements may have persisted in unexpected ways. The megalithic traditions of the Atlantic world, the building of enormous stone monuments aligned with astronomical events and used for the burial and commemoration of the dead, were maintained in some regions of Britain for a remarkably long time. In the Orkneys, megalithic construction continued into the early Bronze Age, long after the genetic makeup of the population had shifted away from the Neolithic farming ancestry with which those traditions had first arrived. The traditions outlasted the people who had created them. They were adopted and continued by communities whose ancestry was increasingly derived from the steppe migrants who had replaced the earlier farmers across most of Britain. This is a pattern that the ancient DNA is helping us to understand more clearly. Culture and genetics do not track each other perfectly. Cultural traditions can outlast the populations that created them, being adopted and continued and adapted by people who are genetically quite different from the original practitioners. Language can be retained or changed independently of genetic ancestry. Religion and art and architecture can spread through populations without necessarily being carried by migrating people. The most famous monuments in Britain, the stone circles and passage tombs that dot the landscape of Scotland and Ireland and Wales and England, were created by people whose genetic ancestry has largely been replaced in the modern population, but they are still there. They are still aligned with the movements of the sun and moon that the people who built them tracked with such precision and cared about so deeply. They are still in use, in a sense, as sites of pilgrimage and ceremony and contemplation. Thousands of years after the people who first constructed them are gone, the stones carry the memory of their builders. The DNA of those builders mostly does not. The county of Wiltshire, in southern England, contains an extraordinary concentration of prehistoric monuments. Stonehenge. Avebury, which is in many ways even more impressive in its scale, a henge enclosure nearly a mile in diameter, surrounded by a deep ditch and bank, and originally containing hundreds of standing stones. Silbury Hill, the largest man-made mound in prehistoric Europe, whose purpose remains genuinely unknown despite a century of investigation. The West Kennet Long Barrow, a chambered Neolithic tomb, whose passage and chambers were sealed around 5,500 years ago after receiving the remains of perhaps 50 individuals over the course of several centuries. The ancient DNA from West Kennet and from other Wiltshire Neolithic sites has been analysed, and it tells a consistent story. The people buried in these monuments were Neolithic farmers of the Anatolian-derived lineage. They were the builders and maintainers of the megalithic tradition, the people whose world was organized around these enormous communal constructions that served as the focal points of their religious and social life. What we do not yet fully understand is the relationship between these monument-building communities and the wider network of Atlantic megalithic cultures. The similarity between monuments across vast distances, between the passage tombs of Ireland and those of Brittany and those of Iberia, has long suggested cultural contact. The ancient DNA is now confirming that those cultural connections were underlain by genuine genetic connections, by the movement of actual people between these communities, but the nature of those movements is still unclear. Were they regular migrations of families and communities? Were they the movements of specialists, builders and priests and astronomers who traveled between monument sites, carrying their technical and ceremonial knowledge? Were they pilgrimage routes along which people moved between sacred sites, sharing ancestral bones and cultural practices and genetic ancestry in the process? Silbury Hill in particular remains one of the most tantalizing mysteries in the ancient British archaeological record. It was built around 2500 BCE during the late Neolithic or very early Bronze Age, and it required the movement of approximately 500,000 tons of material. It was built in stages, over a period that may have extended over several centuries. And despite extensive archaeological investigation, including a series of tunnels dug through it over the past 2 centuries, its purpose is genuinely unknown. There are no burials inside it. There are no artifacts that clearly indicate a ritual function, though the association with the nearby ceremonial complex at Avebury makes a ritual purpose seem most likely. The ancient DNA of its builders, the late Neolithic community associated with the Avebury complex, shows exactly the transition that we would expect from the broader pattern of British prehistory. The earliest associated individuals show Neolithic farmer ancestry. The later associated individuals begin to show signs of the incoming Beaker ancestry that was transforming the genetic makeup of southern Britain during precisely this period. Silbury Hill may therefore be a monument whose construction spanned the transition from the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, a project begun by one population and completed by another, or perhaps maintained as a sacred site by the new population who inherited it along with the landscape in which they settled. The DNA cannot tell us which, but it adds a poignant dimension to the mystery. The Great Mound may be a monument to a world that was already ending, as the final stages of its construction were completed. The ancient DNA research is also beginning to illuminate the history of specific genetic variants, changes in single base pairs in the genome that have important consequences for human health and survival, and that therefore track quite differently through populations than the broad patterns of ancestry. One of the most extensively studied of these variants is the one that confers adult lactase persistence, the ability to digest the milk sugar lactose in adulthood. Most mammals, including most humans, stop producing the enzyme lactase after weaning, which means that consuming large quantities of milk as an adult causes digestive discomfort or worse. But a specific genetic variant, present in high frequencies in northern European populations, including in Britain, allows adults to continue producing lactase throughout their lives. This variant, often called the LP allele, enables adults to drink milk safely and to access the substantial nutritional resources that dairy products represent. The ancient DNA record of Britain is providing a fascinating story about how this variant became common. Contrary to what might be assumed, the LP allele did not spread rapidly with the Neolithic farmers who introduced cattle and dairy farming to Britain. The ancient genomes of Neolithic farmers in Britain show low frequencies of the LP allele, even though they were clearly raising cattle and presumably using their milk and dairy products in some form. The allele appears to have spread much later, not reaching high frequencies until well into the Bronze Age, and in some regions even later. Why? This is a genuine puzzle that researchers have actively debated. One recent proposal, based on analysis of ancient DNA from a large number of European sites, suggests that the LP allele spread dramatically during periods of famine or epidemic disease, when the ability to access calories from dairy, even at the cost of some digestive discomfort, provided a meaningful survival advantage. Under normal conditions, even people without the LP allele can consume modest amounts of dairy without severe consequences. But under conditions of stress and near starvation, the ability to access more calories from milk could make a meaningful difference to survival. If this hypothesis is correct, then the high frequency of the LP allele in modern northern European populations, including in Britain, is a record of past catastrophes. Each major famine or epidemic that swept through ancient populations may have increased the frequency of a variant that allowed its carriers to survive marginally better than their peers. The prosperity of modern dairy farming cultures in northern Europe may be built, at least in part, on the selective pressure of ancient famines. As we move toward the most recent layers of Britain's ancient DNA story, we come to a period that is close enough to the present to feel less like deep prehistory and more like the borderlands of history, but that is still illuminated by the ancient DNA research in important ways. The Norman conquest of 1066 is one of the most famous events in English history. William the Conqueror's invasion of England and his victory at the Battle of Hastings transformed the political and cultural landscape of the island in ways that are still visible today, in the English language, in the legal system, in the architecture of castles and cathedrals, in the names of the aristocracy, in countless dimensions of English culture. But what genetic impact did the Norman conquest have? The answer, based on the ancient DNA evidence that is beginning to accumulate from this period, is more modest than the cultural impact might suggest. The Normans who conquered England were themselves the descendants of Norse settlers who had established themselves in northern France a century or two earlier and had been rapidly assimilated into the Frankish population, adopting the French language and much of the French cultural tradition while retaining a strong political identity. By the time of the conquest, their genetic makeup was therefore already a mixture of Scandinavian and northern French ancestry. When these Normans arrived in England, they were a relatively small military and political elite, imposing themselves on a much larger existing population. The genetic evidence suggests that the Normans who settled in England after the conquest contributed a real but limited genetic signal to the English population, concentrated in the aristocracy and in areas of particularly intense Norman settlement. In most of the English population, the Norman conquest shows up as a relatively modest addition to the existing mix of ancestries rather than as a dramatic transformation. This is consistent with the general pattern of the post-Roman period in Britain. The major demographic events are mostly earlier, in the prehistoric and early medieval period. By the time of the Norman conquest, the broad outlines of the genetic structure of the British Isles were already in place. What followed was refinement and mixing and the addition of new contributions, but not the wholesale replacement events of the Neolithic and Bronze Age. There is a question that hangs over the entire ancient DNA enterprise in Britain, and that is worth addressing directly before we move toward the conclusion of this exploration. The question is about what the science can and cannot tell us, and about the humility that is required when we encounter its limits. Ancient DNA can tell us about ancestry with increasing precision and reliability. It can tell us which modern reference populations a given ancient individual is most closely related to. It can track the movement of specific genetic variants through time and across geography. It can identify close relatives within and across archaeological sites. It can even, with some uncertainty, make inferences about certain physical traits like skin and eye color and the ability to digest lactose. But it cannot tell us about culture. It cannot tell us what language anyone spoke, or what stories they told around their fires, or what they believed about the nature of the world and what came after death. It cannot tell us about the quality of relationships between people, about kindness and cruelty, about joy and suffering. It cannot tell us who a person was in any sense that the people who knew them would recognize. This is not a criticism of ancient DNA research. It is simply an accurate description of what a scientific method can and cannot do. The genomes that researchers extract from ancient bones are extraordinarily informative about specific questions, but they are silent on others. And the temptation to read into the genetic data more than it actually says, to make the bones speak about things they cannot speak about, is one that researchers must continuously resist. The ancient DNA of Britain tells us that many different peoples came to the island over many thousands of years, and that each of them contributed something to the genetic makeup of the population that followed. It does not tell us which of those peoples had the richest cultural lives, which built the most beautiful things, which told the most profound stories. It does not tell us which of them deserves to be called the true Britons, because there are no true Britons, only an endless succession of people who came and stayed and changed and were changed, and eventually passed on something of themselves to those who came after. And yet, for all its limitations, there is something in the ancient DNA research that goes beyond the specific genetic findings and touches something more fundamental about what it means to be human. Every ancient genome that researchers sequence was a person, a unique, unrepeatable individual who lived a life that was as fully realized, as complex, as filled with meaning and feeling and experience as any life being lived today. The technical vocabulary of genomics, the language of allele frequencies and admixture proportions and haplogroups, can make it easy to forget this. When we talk about the Yamnaya expansion or the Bell Beaker phenomenon, we are talking about millions of individual lives, each one as particular and irreplaceable as any life you know. The ancient DNA research is slowly building a picture of what those lives looked like at a biological level, who their relatives were, where their ancestors had come from, whether they had the genetic variants for certain diseases, certain physical traits, certain dietary capacities. It is extraordinary what the science can reveal. And it is also humbling to recognize how much it cannot reveal, how much of what made each of those individual lives what it was is gone completely, dissolved with the soft tissues and the memories and the relationships and the voices that no science can recover. The great chambered tombs of Neolithic Britain were built to house the dead, to keep them present in some sense within the landscape of the living. The bones of the dead were curated, sometimes moved between tombs, sometimes brought out for ceremonies and then returned. The relationship between the living and the dead in Neolithic Britain seems to have been one of ongoing engagement rather than simple disposal. The dead were neighbours, the dead were ancestors, the dead were, in some sense, still participants in the life of the community. The ancient DNA research is making those dead neighbours speak again, not in the way the Neolithic communities imagined their dead speaking, not through the medium of ritual and ceremony and the maintenance of ancestral presence in the landscape, but through the medium of chemistry and computation and the painstaking work of people in white suits, in clean rooms who are learning to read the messages encoded in molecules that survived against all odds. It is a different kind of speaking, but it is real. And it is telling us things about who those people were that we could not have known any other way. The last thing worth saying before we let the ancient dead rest, and before we let ourselves rest in the quiet that the end of a long exploration naturally brings, is about the future, about what we will know in 10 or 20 years that we do not yet know today. The ancient DNA field is moving with extraordinary speed. The number of ancient genomes published each year is growing rapidly. The resolution of the analysis, the ability to detect subtle signals of distant ancestry and ancient population mixing is improving constantly. New sites are being excavated. New samples are being collected from skeletons that have been in museum collections for decades but never previously analyzed genetically. Ancient DNA researchers are working on time periods and regions that were completely inaccessible to them just a few years ago. In Britain specifically, the areas most likely to yield significant new findings in the coming years include the period immediately following the end of the last ice age, when the first modern humans returned to the island and established the initial post-glacial population whose subsequent fate the Neolithic transformations so dramatically altered. The genomes of those earliest post-glacial Britons, only a handful of which have been successfully sequenced so far, will tell us more about the founding population of modern Britain than we currently know. The early medieval period, the centuries between the end of Roman rule and the establishment of the early English kingdoms, is another area where the ancient DNA record is still relatively thin. The demographic transformations of this period, the combination of Anglo-Saxon immigration, British population continuity, and the various smaller migrations that accompanied them, are still not fully understood at a genetic level. More ancient genomes from this period will almost certainly produce findings that revise or refine the current picture. And beyond Britain, the ancient DNA research is going to clarify the picture of the broader Atlantic world of which Britain was a part, answering questions about the connections between the megalithic communities of Britain and those of Brittany and Iberia and the Western Mediterranean, questions that the current evidence suggests were real and substantial, but cannot yet characterize fully. The picture of Britain's past that ancient DNA is building is the most detailed and most accurate we have ever had, and it is still, in many important respects, incomplete. The complete picture, if it is ever achieved, will be built over the careers of researchers who are today just beginning their work, who will spend their professional lives extracting and sequencing and analyzing ancient genomes, and who will discover things that none of us can currently imagine. That is the nature of genuine science. It is not a list of established facts. It is a process of inquiry that is always generating new questions alongside its answers. And in no field is that more true than in ancient DNA research, where every new genome is a new window into a world that we have barely begun to see. Somewhere on this island, right now, in some field, or beneath some city pavement, or in the waterlogged sediments of some ancient riverbank, there are bones waiting. Ancient bones that carry within them genetic information that no one has yet read. Information about a migration that historians have not documented, a mixing event that no current model predicts, an individual who travelled from somewhere so far away that their presence in Britain seems impossible until the DNA makes it undeniable. Those bones are patient. They have already waited for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer for the archaeologist who will find them, the researcher who will extract their DNA, the analyst who will sequence and interpret what they contain, And when that day comes, the story of Britain's ancient past will be richer and stranger and more complicated than it is today, which is saying something, because it is already extraordinarily rich and strange and complicated. The island that sits in the grey Atlantic, battered by its constant westerlies, wrapped in the soft light that filters through clouds for most of the year, has been the destination of more human journeys, the scene of more demographic transformations, the repository of more layers of accumulated ancestry than almost any other comparable piece of land on Earth. Stonehenge stands on Salisbury Plain, as it has for more than 4,000 years. The people who built it are mostly gone from the genetic record, replaced by others who were themselves replaced by others again, but the stones remain. And, in their long endurance, in the way they have outlasted every population that has gazed at them with whatever mixture of reverence and incomprehension the moment contained, they are perhaps the most honest monument to what British history actually is. Not the story of any one people, not the story of a continuous, unbroken connection between the present and some ancient founding moment, but the story of a place, a landscape, a set of conditions that has attracted people for as long as people have existed anywhere nearby, and that has received all of them, in the end, into its soil, and kept something of each of them, some fragment of their bones or their genes or their handiwork, waiting for those of us who come later to find it and wonder what it means. If the journey through all of this, through the deep time of ancient British genetics and the mysteries of prehistoric migrations and the slow revelation of what the DNA is beginning to say about who these ancient people were, has given your mind something to wander through as the night grows quiet around you, then this is what it was made for. The bones are at rest. The scientists will return to their clean rooms tomorrow. The analysis will continue. The findings will accumulate. The picture will slowly, patiently, become clearer. But for tonight, there is only the quiet, the breath, the ancient sky above whatever roof you are sleeping under, the same sky that crossed over Cheddar Man and the Neolithic farmers and the Beaker people and the Iron Age Celts and the Roman soldiers from North Africa and the Anglo-Saxon settlers and the Norse and the Normans and every other person who has ever looked up from the surface of this complicated, layered, endlessly fascinating Atau Indand, wondered where they came from and what it means. Let the wondering rest now. Let the questions settle into the comfortable dark, where questions often resolve themselves without effort into something like understanding. The ancient dead are at peace. The living, on their particular edge of this long story, can afford to be too. Rest well. The mystery will be here in the morning. There is a lake in Cumbria, in the northwest of England, called Bassenthwaite. It sits beneath a fell called Skiddaw, one of the oldest mountains in Britain, made of rock that formed almost 500 million years ago. People have been living around that lake for at least 9,000 years. We know this because the lake sediments record pollen from ancient trees and ancient agricultural activity and the charcoal from ancient fires, layer by layer, going down through time in a stratigraphic record that is almost as informative as a book. What the sediment record from Bassenthwaite and from dozens of similar lake sites across Britain shows is the ecological impact of the people whose ancient DNA we have been discussing. The arrival of the Neolithic farmers around 6,000 years ago shows up in lake sediments as a sudden and dramatic change in the pollen record. The elm decline, a sharp reduction in elm pollen that appears at roughly the same time across Britain, marks what appears to be the beginning of large-scale forest clearance. Elm leaves were used as fodder for domestic animals in ways that would have damaged the trees. The forests were being pushed back. The landscape was being transformed. This transformation was not random. It was directed by human intention, by communities that had a vision of what the landscape should look like, and the ability to work collectively over years and decades to realize that vision. The great open downlands of southern England, the chalk grasslands that are so celebrated today as examples of ancient, semi-natural habitat, are not natural at all in the sense of being untouched by human action. They are the product of Neolithic and Bronze Age farming, of thousands of years of grazing and cultivation that prevented the forests from reclaiming the land that had been cleared. The people whose DNA is preserved in the bones beneath those downlands created the landscape that their descendants, Wave after wave of newcomers, transforming the genetic makeup of the island without quite transforming its physical character, would continue to inhabit and work, and eventually come to think of as timeless and ancient. One of the things that the ancient DNA research is making increasingly clear is how wrong our instinctive sense of prehistory is. We tend to think of prehistoric people as simple, their lives repetitive and unchanging, their worlds static and slow. But the genetic record tells a story of rapid and dramatic change, of transformations that happened within the lifetimes of individuals, of a world that was as dynamic and surprising and full of novelty as any world that has come since. Consider what it would have been like to be a person living in Britain around 4,300 years ago, at the beginning of the Beaker transition. Your parents were farmers, Neolithic farmers of the kind that had worked this landscape for generations. They knew the land, knew the seasons, knew the routines of cultivation and herding that sustained the community. They knew the great stone monuments, the circles and henges and long barrows that their ancestors had built and that served as the focal points of the community's religious and ancestral life. And then, within your own lifetime perhaps, or within the lifetime of your children, new people were arriving. People with different material culture, different burial practices, different styles of pottery and metalwork. People who, in some areas, appear to have arrived in numbers sufficient to transform the community within a generation or two. You might have married one of them, or your child might have. You might have traded with them, or competed with them, or been displaced by them. The ancient DNA shows us the end state of this process, the genetic transformation from predominantly Neolithic farmer ancestry to predominantly Beaker ancestry. But it cannot show us the texture of the lived experience of that transition, the particular stories of particular families navigating a world that was changing faster than any previous generation had experienced it changing. Every major genetic transition that the ancient DNA reveals in British prehistory was lived by individuals. Each of those individuals had a perspective on what was happening around them, shaped by their particular position in the community, their relationships with the newcomers, their understanding of what was being lost and what was being gained. Those perspectives are gone, but the genetic record they left behind is in some sense a trace of the choices they made, the people they chose to have children with, the communities they chose to join or resist, or simply survive within. Here is a question that has occurred to every thoughtful person who has studied the ancient DNA of Britain and who has then looked at the physical landscape of the island. A question that does not have a simple answer, but that is worth sitting with. Why is Britain so densely populated with the physical monuments of its prehistoric past? There are estimated to be around 30,000 ancient monuments in England alone, from the most modest standing stones to the extraordinary complexes of Stonehenge and Avebury. Scotland, Wales, and Ireland each have their own dense concentrations of ancient structures, many of them among the most impressive prehistoric monuments in the world. Part of the answer is geology. Britain has abundant stone of the right kind, hard stone that can be shaped and moved and erected, and that survives for millennia in the landscape. The presence of flint in the chalklands of southern England, of granite and gneiss in the north and west, of sandstone across the Midlands, gave the prehistoric inhabitants of the island the raw materials for monumental construction that some other regions lack. Part of the answer is population density. The ancient DNA tells us that Britain, during the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, was densely populated relative to the earlier Mesolithic period, and that its communities had the organizational capacity and the surplus resources to commit enormous amounts of labor to monument construction. Communities capable of building Silbury Hill or the Avebury complex were not small, scattered, or marginally subsisting. They were substantial, well-organized, and capable of sustained collective effort over many years. But part of the answer may also be something harder to articulate. Some quality of the British landscape itself that has encouraged, across many different cultures and many different historical periods, the impulse to mark the land with permanent structures. To say in stone that people were here and that this place mattered, and that the relationship between the human community and this particular piece of ground was worth inscribing permanently in the physical world. That impulse, whatever its origins, created a landscape that is now one of the richest archaeological records in the world. And that record, increasingly illuminated by the ancient DNA extracted from the bones buried within and beneath and around those monuments, is telling us a story about the depth and complexity of human history in a small island at the edge of the known world that is more extraordinary than anything we had previously imagined. Scientists working on ancient DNA frequently have the experience of being surprised by their own results. This is something that distinguishes genuine science from the kind of storytelling that can dress itself up as science, cherry-picking evidence that confirms a predetermined conclusion. The researchers who are producing the most significant findings in ancient British genetics are repeatedly finding that the data does not confirm their initial expectations, that the evidence points somewhere different from where they thought it would point, that the reality of the deep past is stranger and more complicated than any model they had built in advance. This is not a sign that the science is unreliable. It is a sign that the science is working as it should. The whole point of scientific investigation is to discover what is actually true, not to confirm what you already believe. And in a field as young and as rapidly developing as ancient DNA, there are many more opportunities for genuine surprise than there are in more mature sciences where the basic parameters are well established. The surprises are not over. The science is still young. The databases of ancient genomes are still growing. The analytical methods are still improving. And the Earth is still full of ancient human remains that have not yet been analyzed, that are sitting in museum drawers or beneath field and forest floors, waiting to add their particular testimonies to the accumulating body of evidence. Britain is a particularly rich environment for this kind of investigation, precisely because it is so extensively studied, because its archaeological record is so thoroughly mapped, because the institutional infrastructure for ancient DNA research is well developed, and because the questions being asked about its population history are specific and consequential enough to justify the considerable expense and technical effort required. The next decade of ancient DNA research in Britain will almost certainly produce findings that make everything written here seem partial and preliminary. That is not a problem. That is the point. Every advance in knowledge should make the questions it raises seem more interesting, not less. One of the most poignant aspects of the ancient DNA research is what it occasionally reveals about individual kinship, about family. In the megalithic tombs of Neolithic Britain, researchers sometimes find individuals who are related to each other, not distantly, in the way that any two members of a small agricultural community might share ancestry, but closely. Parent and child, siblings, grandparent and grandchild. The people who were buried together in these great communal tombs were, in at least some cases, literally family members. People who had known each other in life, who had been part of the same household or the same close kin group, who were now sharing the same eternal home in the monument that their community had built to honor its dead. The Neolithic people of the Orcadian archipelago, who built the passage tomb at Maeshowe, and the stone circles at the Ring of Brodgar, and the Stennis standing stones, and the remarkable settlement of Skara Brae, are among the best studied of all ancient British populations from a genetic standpoint. And the kinship patterns that emerge from that DNA analysis paint a picture of a community in which the dead were genuinely present in a continuing community of the living and the deceased. Some of the individuals buried in the Orcadian monuments show evidence of being related to people buried in monuments that were built generations later. The family connections were maintained through time, inscribed in the genetic record, even as the physical bodies of the individuals decayed, and the monuments that housed them accumulated the remains of successive generations. What must it have been like to belong to such a community? To live in a world where the bones of your ancestors were literally present in the landscape around you, housed in monuments that had been built by your own ancestors generations before your birth, that you yourself would maintain and add to throughout your life, and that would eventually receive your own remains? The relationship between the living and the dead in Neolithic Britain was not the distant, abstract relationship that modernity tends to create between the present and the past. It was immediate, physical, spatial. The dead were neighbours. The island of Britain has been, for as long as people have been writing about it, a source of mystery and fascination to those who came from other places. Julius Caesar, whose two expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BCE were the first documented Roman contact with the island, wrote about the Britons with a mixture of military assessment and genuine curiosity. He noted their unusual customs, their mode of warfare, their political structures. He was, in some sense, doing what researchers do today with ancient DNA, trying to understand who these people were and where they had come from. Caesar noted that the interior of Britain was inhabited by people who claimed, according to their own tradition, to be indigenous, to have always been there. The coastal regions, he observed, showed more signs of recent immigration from the continent, of people whose connections to Belgic Gaul, in what is now northern France, were still visible in their customs and material culture. What Caesar could not have known, what no one in his world could have known, is how much more complex and layered the history of the people he was observing actually was. The people who claimed to be indigenous were themselves the products of multiple waves of immigration going back thousands of years. The people of the coasts, with their continental connections, were adding yet another layer to an already deeply stratified genetic and cultural inheritance. The ancient DNA is allowing us, for the first time, to see what Caesar could not see, to look beneath the surface of the Iron Age society he encountered and trace the deeper history that lay beneath it. And what that deeper history shows is that the island Caesar visited was already the product of tens of thousands of years of human presence, tens of thousands of years of arrivals and departures and transformations, layer upon layer of peopling and repeopling that the genetics is only now making visible. There is a final thought that the ancient DNA research suggests, and it is perhaps the most important one. The story of the British Isles, as the genetics reveals it, is not a story of competition between pure peoples, of authentic descendants displacing inauthentic newcomers, or vice versa. It is a story of continuous encounter, continuous negotiation, continuous becoming. The people who are in Britain now are the product of all the people who have ever been in Britain. Their DNA is a library of human history, carrying in its pages the stories of hunters and farmers and warriors and monks and traders and soldiers and migrants from every direction that the winds of the ancient world blew from. This is not a comfortable story for ideologies that require fixed identities and pure ancestries and settled hierarchies of belonging, but it is the true story. And in its truth, it offers something more valuable than comfort. It offers a way of understanding human identity that is honest about its own complexity and its own depths. We are all, in the end, the products of encounter. The products of people who met and sometimes fought, and sometimes traded, and sometimes loved, and always in the long run mixed their genes and their cultures and their stories in ways that produced something new. Britain's ancient DNA is one of the most detailed records we have of that process, a record written in the bodies of people who lived and died across thousands of years, and that is now, slowly, being read for the first time. The reading is not finished. It may never be finished, in the sense of being complete and definitive. Human history is too vast, too complex, too full of individual lives that left no trace in the archaeological record for any science to fully capture it. But what the ancient DNA is giving us is something real, something new, a dimension of the past that was completely invisible before and is now becoming legible. And in that new legibility, the past is speaking to the present in a voice that is deeper and stranger and more humbling than any voice we had heard from it before. Listen to it if you can. Let the deep time wash through you for a moment before sleep takes you. Let the ancient migrations resolve into something like peace in the quiet of the night. The bones are patient, the science is young, the story is long, and you are part of it, in ways you may not yet have imagined, in ways that the science is only beginning to reveal. One more thing before the night fully settles, because there is a connection between all of this, between the deep genetic history of Britain and the question of what happened in the ancient world more broadly, that is worth holding in mind as the story comes to rest for the evening. The ancient DNA research in Britain is part of a global project that is slowly reconstructing the genetic history of our entire species. Every ancient genome that is sequenced anywhere in the world adds to the reference framework that makes it possible to interpret every other ancient genome. The British findings illuminate the European context. The European context illuminates the Middle Eastern context. The Middle Eastern context connects to the African context, which is where the whole human story begins. When researchers discover that the steppe-derived ancestry that so dramatically transformed prehistoric Britain ultimately traces to populations on the Pontic steppe of Eurasia, they are connecting the British story to the Eurasian story. When they discover that the Neolithic farmers of Britain carried ancestry from Anatolian populations, they are connecting the British story to the story of the Fertile Crescent and the origins of agriculture. When they discover that the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain shared ancestry with hunter-gatherer populations from across Western Europe and traced their ultimate origins to refugia in southwestern Europe, where people survived the last ice age, they are connecting the British story to the broader story of how modern humans colonized the entire Old World. And somewhere in that vast, interconnected web of human movement and mixing and transformation, there are connections that have not yet been found. Connections that the current reference databases cannot reveal because the relevant ancient populations have not yet been sampled. Ancient DNA from parts of the world where preservation conditions are poor and where research infrastructure is limited is still largely missing from the global analysis. When it becomes available, the picture will change again. The ancient DNA of Britain is an extraordinarily well-studied chapter in a story whose other chapters are still largely unread. Every new chapter that is opened will change the context in which the British chapter is understood, and every finding from Britain will in turn illuminate what is found elsewhere. This is the nature of science as a collective human enterprise. No one discovery, no one laboratory, no one country's ancient DNA tells the complete story. The complete story is something that will only emerge, if it ever fully emerges, from the combination of evidence from everywhere on Earth where ancient human remains can be found and studied. Britain is one piece of that puzzle, an extraordinarily rich piece, a piece with extraordinary preservation challenges but also extraordinary research capacity and a uniquely layered history that makes it one of the most informative pieces available. But it is still just one piece. The puzzle is vast. The work of assembling it is ongoing. And the picture that is emerging, however incomplete and provisional it still is already more beautiful and more strange and more humbling than anything anyone had imagined before the ancient DNA revolution began. That is enough. For one night, to carry into sleep, the ancient DNA research in Britain is not happening in isolation. It is part of a conversation between multiple disciplines that are each contributing their own kind of evidence to the reconstruction of the deep past. And understanding how those disciplines interact with each other, where they agree, and where they produce apparent contradictions that need to be resolved, is essential to understanding what the DNA findings actually mean. Archaeology is the discipline most directly in dialogue with ancient DNA. Archaeologists excavate the sites from which ancient DNA samples are drawn. They provide the contextual information that makes it possible to interpret what the DNA is showing. A genome without context is just a genome. To know who this person was in their community, what role they played, what status they held, what they were buried with, requires the patient interpretive work of the archaeologist. The relationship between archaeology and ancient DNA has not always been easy. The early days of the ancient DNA revolution were marked by some genuine tensions. Archaeologists who had spent careers building nuanced interpretations of cultural change in prehistoric Britain found those interpretations being challenged, sometimes too quickly and too crudely, by geneticists who read cultural complexity out of population genetics in ways that archaeologists found oversimplified. The claim that the Neolithic population of Britain was essentially replaced by the Beaker migrants, for example, was sometimes presented in ways that implied a uniformity and completeness of replacement that the archaeological record, with its evidence of cultural continuity and mixing, did not support. Over time, those tensions have eased, as the two disciplines have learned to work more effectively together. The current generation of ancient DNA studies is characterized by much more sophisticated engagement with the archaeological evidence than the earliest studies achieved. The geneticists are asking archaeologists to help them understand the social contexts of their genetic findings. And the archaeologists are learning to read the genetic evidence with the same care and attention to nuance that they bring to their material evidence. What is emerging from this collaboration is a picture of prehistoric Britain that is more complex and more interesting than either discipline could have produced alone. The ancient DNA tells you what happened in terms of ancestry. The archaeology tells you what happened in terms of material culture and spatial organization and social hierarchy. Together, they tell you something about the people themselves, about the communities they formed and the lives they lived and the choices they made. Linguistics is the third discipline in this conversation, and its contribution is particularly important for understanding the cultural dimensions of the genetic findings. The spread of languages across prehistoric Europe is one of the central problems of historical linguistics. The Indo-European language family, which includes most of the languages spoken in Europe today, as well as many languages of South Asia and Central Asia, clearly had a single ancestral origin. The question is where and when that origin was, and how the family spread so widely. The ancient DNA evidence now strongly supports the hypothesis that the Indo-European languages of Europe spread, at least in large part, with the steppe-derived populations whose expansion we have been discussing. The genetic transformation of Europe during the Beaker period, which brought steppe ancestry to a degree that was essentially unknown in Europe before, coincides closely with what linguists reconstruct as a major expansion of Indo-European languages from the East. But the details of how this linguistic expansion unfolded in Britain specifically are still debated. The Celtic languages, which are the oldest documented Indo-European languages of Britain, share features with other early Indo-European languages of Western Europe in ways that suggest they may have developed as a distinct branch relatively early in the spread of Indo-European languages westward. Whether the Celtic languages arrived in Britain with the initial Beaker migration, or spread through the Atlantic coastal network somewhat later, or arrived with a distinct wave of migration in the Bronze Age or Iron Age, is a question that the ancient DNA cannot answer directly, but that it helps to constrain by telling us when and how genetic transformations occurred. The interaction between the genetic and linguistic evidence is one of the most productive areas of current research in the prehistory of Britain. Every time the ancient DNA identifies a major migration event, linguists ask whether that migration could have brought a new language. Every time linguists propose a new model for the spread of languages, ancient DNA researchers ask whether the genetic evidence is consistent with the population movements that model requires. The questions push each other toward better and more precise answers than either could find alone. There is something about the geography of Britain that keeps recurring in the ancient DNA research as a structuring factor, something that shapes how the genetic story unfolds across the island in ways that go beyond simple proximity. The distinction between Highland Britain and Lowland Britain is one of the oldest and most persistent structural divisions in the island's history. The Highlands of Scotland, Wales, and southwestern England are geologically ancient, made of hard rock that has resisted erosion for hundreds of millions of years. They are rugged and wet, and in many areas, particularly in the Northwest Highlands, agriculturally marginal. They were never as densely populated as the lowlands. They were harder to reach and harder to pass through. The lowlands of England, particularly the south and east, are made of younger, softer rock, much of it chalk or limestone, with deep, fertile soils that are among the most productive agricultural land in northern Europe. They are easily traversed. They have historically been more densely populated, more connected to the continent, more exposed to successive waves of immigration. This geographic distinction maps onto a genetic distinction that the ancient DNA is making increasingly clear. The populations of Highland Britain have, consistently across multiple historical periods, retained more of the older genetic profiles characteristic of earlier populations than the populations of lowland Britain. When the Beaker migrants arrived, they appear to have penetrated the lowlands more rapidly and more completely than the highlands. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived, they transformed eastern England more completely than western and northern Britain. When the Norse arrived, they had their greatest genetic impact in the Northern Isles and the western coastal areas, accessible by sea, but less impact on the interior highlands. This means that if you want to find the genetic traces of Britain's older populations, the populations that existed before the most recent transforming waves of migration, you are more likely to find them in the geographical margins. In the uplands of Wales and Scotland, in the far southwest of England, on the offshore islands, in the places where geography provided a degree of protection from the full force of demographic change. These are also, of course, the places where the Celtic languages survived longest, where the oldest traditions of story and song and ceremonial practice have been most tenaciously maintained. The coincidence between linguistic conservatism and genetic conservatism is not surprising because both reflect the same underlying reality. Geography shapes the rate and extent of cultural and demographic change. The margins are always more conservative than the centers, because the forces of change that operate through the centres are attenuated by the time they reach the edges. There is a particular archaeological site in Scotland that represents something close to a miracle of preservation, and that is now yielding ancient DNA of extraordinary quality and significance. That site is Skara Brae in Orkney, the Neolithic settlement that was buried by a storm around 4,500 years ago and preserved almost perfectly beneath a sand dune until its accidental discovery in 1850. Skara Brae gives us something extraordinarily rare in prehistoric archaeology, a well-preserved snapshot of Neolithic domestic life. The stone furniture, the beds and dressers and hearths, is still in place. The remains of the daily life of the people who lived there, their tools and their food waste, and in some cases their bones, are still recoverable after 4,500 years. The ancient DNA from Skara Brae and from the surrounding Orcadian megalithic complex is among the most extensively studied in British prehistory. And it has revealed, alongside the broad population genetic findings we have already discussed, specific and intimate details about the people who lived there that no other method could have produced. We know that the people of Neolithic Orkney were genetically related to each other within the small communities they formed around their monuments. We know that they practiced a degree of endogamy, marrying within relatively restricted circles, which is what you would expect from a small island community dependent on a limited number of suitable partners. We know that their DNA shows the characteristic Anatolian-derived farmer ancestry of the Neolithic expansion, but with some distinctive regional features that distinguish the Orcadian Neolithic population from contemporaneous populations in mainland Britain. What we do not know, and what may never be fully knowable, is what the people of Skara Brae thought about the great stone structures they built and maintained. What did the Ring of Brodgar mean to them? What rituals were performed at the stones of Stenness, whose individual uprights can weigh more than 30 tons each? What was the relationship between the stone circles and the passage tomb at Maeshowe, aligned with the midwinter sunset and the settlement of Skara Brae a few miles away? These questions may be permanently beyond our reach. The ancient DNA has given us the people in their genetic specificity. The archaeology has given us the outlines of their material world. But the inner life of the Neolithic Orcadians, the things they believed and feared and hoped for, the conversations they had and the songs they sang, and the stories they told each other on winter evenings, when the wind off the Atlantic was howling around the stone walls of their homes, those are gone, as completely as if they had never existed. And yet, in another sense, they are not entirely gone, because the stones are still there. The Ring of Brodgar still stands against the Orcadian sky, its surviving uprights, casting long shadows on the midsummer solstice, its great circular ditch still holding the water that the Neolithic builders dug it to contain. Whatever the people of Skara Brae believed about that ring, they believed it enough to commit years of communal labour to its construction. They believed it enough to centre their ceremonial world around it for centuries. The stones carry something of that belief, even if we cannot name it. And the ancient DNA carries something of the people who held it, even if we cannot hear their voices. If there is a single lesson that the ancient DNA research on Britain is capable of teaching, a single insight that the genetics can offer to anyone who engages seriously and honestly with what it shows, it might be this. The past was never simple. The people who came before us were never less complex, less varied, less surprising than we are. The temptation to flatten the past into simple categories, into clean stories of pure peoples with clear identities doing straightforward things, is a temptation that the evidence will not support. The past was as messy and as complicated and as full of unexpected contingency as the present, and the people in it were as real as we are, as different from each other, as full of their own particular experiences and perspectives and relationships and ideas. The ancient DNA is not giving us access to any of that richness directly. It is giving us a particular kind of information, genetic information, that is extraordinarily precise and reliable within its domain, and that tells us things no other evidence could tell us. But it cannot tell us everything. And the humility to know what it cannot tell us is as important as the ability to read what it can. Britain's ancient DNA is rewriting the story of who the British people are and where they came from. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the most significant intellectual developments in the understanding of British history in the past century. The findings are real, they are robust, and they matter. but they are not the whole story. They are a new and extraordinarily valuable chapter in a story whose other chapters are written in stone and in pollen and in the fossil record and in linguistic reconstruction and in the oral traditions that have persisted in the margins of the island and in the archaeological record of material, culture, and in all the other ways that the past leaves traces for those of us who come after to read. The whole story is larger than any single method can capture. It is larger than any single discipline can contain. It is, perhaps, larger than we can ever fully comprehend. But that does not stop us from trying. And the trying, the patient, rigorous, humble, always surprised by the evidence trying, is what science is. Britain's bones are speaking. The science is listening. And what it hears is extraordinary. Before the last light goes out in this long exploration, there is one more thing worth saying. Something that does not belong to the science exactly, but that belongs to the experience of encountering the science, of sitting with what it is revealing. There is a peculiar intimacy in the ancient DNA research that no other kind of historical investigation quite replicates. When a researcher extracts a genome from a fragment of ancient tooth enamel, they are handling something that was once literally part of a living person. The molecules they are sequencing were synthesized inside the body of a real human being, maintained and replicated throughout that person's life, passed on to their children if they had them, and then preserved in the dark and the cold for thousands of years until the day that the technology existed to read them. This is not abstract. This is as close as we will ever come to the people of the ancient past. Closer, in some ways, than the objects they left behind. A stone tool or a piece of pottery tells you something about what someone did, about the skills they had and the materials they worked with. But the DNA tells you something about what someone was, about the deep biological reality of their existence, the molecular substrate on which everything else about them was built. And there is something in that closeness, something in the intimacy of this particular kind of knowledge that makes the ancient dead feel less distant, less simply past, more present, in some strange way, than they have ever been before. The bones in their graves across the length and breadth of Britain are not simply evidence, they are people. And the science that is learning to read their DNA is in a way that no previous generation could have imagined, beginning to know them. Not completely. Not in the way that knowing a living person means, but knowing them in the one dimension that time has preserved. Knowing who they were, in the deepest molecular sense of that phrase. That is something new in the world. And it is, if you let yourself feel it properly, genuinely extraordinary. The night is quiet. The ancient DNA research continues in laboratories across the world. The bones wait patiently in the earth and in the museum cases. And somewhere in all of that waiting and all of that investigation, the deep past and the living present are in conversation with each other across the vast distances of time, a conversation that is only just beginning, whose most significant revelations are still ahead. Listen while you can. Rest while you must. The story will still be here when morning comes. Good night, and thank you for traveling this far through deep time. The ancient world is grateful for every curious mind that still bothers to ask where we really came from. The answer, as you have heard tonight, is everywhere. We came from everywhere, and everywhere we went, we left something of ourselves behind.